The Edwardian era, often called the golden afternoon before the storm of World War I, was a time when society shimmered with wealth, elegance, and enough social snobbery to fill a ballroom. Britain's upper classes dressed in tailored suits, diamond tiaras, and the sort of fashion that required at least 3 servants to keep you upright. It was a world of excess, grandeur, and a slightly unhealthy obsession with making sure everyone knew just how rich you were. This was not an age of subtlety. Status was announced through grand country houses, glittering dinner parties, and exotic holidays to places where locals would politely tolerate your monocle. If you were wealthy, you weren't just living well, you were living loud. Every detail of Edwardian high society screamed wealth, from the cut of your waistcoat to the size of your garden maze. And yet, amid the opera tickets and tea dances, a new symbol of status appeared on the horizon, the motor car. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. To understand just how radical this was, picture it. The Edwardians lived in a society still deeply tied to tradition. Horses had powered transport for centuries, carriages lined the streets, liveried footmen opened doors, and manure, let's be honest, was everywhere. But now, here came the motor car, a noisy, oily contraption that didn't need feeding, didn't leave steaming piles behind it, and could terrify both pedestrians and livestock with equal efficiency. The arrival of this machine represented more than just a new way of getting around. It embodied the entire Edwardian hunger for progress. Electricity was lighting up drawing rooms, telephones were beginning to ring in upper-class homes, and airplanes were fluttering into existence like ambitious dragonflies. The car slotted perfectly into this cultural moment, not just as a machine but as a statement. The future had wheels, and it was fashionable. And make no mistake, owning a car wasn't about practicality. Early Edwardian cars were unreliable, expensive, and needed more constant attention than a spoiled Pekingese. But the point wasn't to get from point A to point B, it was to be seen doing it. Rolling up to your country estate in a motor car wasn't simply arriving, it was arriving with the subtlety of a brass band. Your neighbours might still own horses, but you had something louder, shinier, and infinitely more likely to explode. The Edwardian elite loved this kind of spectacle. This was the generation that built country houses with more bedrooms than residents, and ballrooms designed solely to impress whichever duke wandered in. The car fit beautifully into this environment. It was the mechanical equivalent of a tiara, a sparkling, impractical demonstration that you were better than everyone else. But there was also a deeper cultural shift at play. The Edwardian world stood at the intersection of tradition and modernity. On one side you had centuries of aristocratic rituals, fox hunts, horse-drawn carriages, rigid etiquette, and long summers of garden parties. On the other side you had the hum of engines, the whir of electricity, the flickering magic of cinema. Cars weren't just transportation, they were an emblem of that clash, a loud metallic declaration that the modern world was pushing in. And of course, because this was Edwardian Britain, the motor car became instantly entangled in the world of class. Ordinary people might look at the new machines with suspicion or outright terror when one barreled down a muddy road, but the wealthy saw them as their personal toys. Cars became a way to draw the line between the haves and have-nots. After all, if you could afford one, you weren't just rich, you were rich enough to laugh at mechanical breakdowns as part of the fun. Imagine being a villager in 1905, seeing one of these machines roar past for the first time. Your horses reared, your chickens scattered, and you clutched your hat in disbelief. Meanwhile, the passengers inside the car were wrapped in goggles and dusters, feeling like pioneers of the future. It must have felt like a circus parade had crashed into your quiet lane, except the elephants were faster and occasionally burst into flames. This tension, the traditional world of the horse colliding with the modern hum of the car, perfectly captured the Edwardian spirit. It was a time of confidence, innovation, and more than a little arrogance. People truly believed the future was limitless, that progress would continue to dazzle, and that the world was entering a glittering new age. Spoiler alert, within a decade, that optimism would meet the mud and trenches of the First World War. But for now, for the elite, life was an endless parade of luxury, speed, and spectacle. The motor car was the shiny new toy that symbolized it all. You didn't buy one because you needed to travel. You bought one because you wanted to embody the Edwardian dream, wealth, modernity, and the thrill of being admired. Or, to put it another way, owning a car wasn't about transport. It was about announcing loudly, "Yes, I am rich enough to terrify horses." Picture the Edwardian street before the motorcar muscled its way onto the scene. The rhythmic clatter of hooves, the creak of wooden wheels, and the occasional splash of manure to ruin your shoes. Transportation was a symphony of neighs, whinnies, and the steady swish of a driver's whip. The horse-drawn carriage wasn't just a method of travel. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life. Aristocrats displayed their wealth with glossy thoroughbreds and gilded coaches. Middle-class families hired cabs, and farmers depended on their dependable old nags for work and movement. The pace of life was set by how quickly a horse could trot. Spoiler, it wasn't very quick. Then, in came the motor car, a machine that sounded like thunder, smelled like a chemistry experiment gone wrong, and had the audacity to move without so much as a flick of a whip. To an Edwardian eye, it was both thrilling and terrifying. This was cultural whiplash at its finest. Centuries of hay and hooves were suddenly swapped for smoke and gasoline, and while some people embraced the shift, others grumbled, cursed, or tried to pass laws to get these noisy intruders off the road. For the wealthy, carriages weren't just vehicles, they were an extension of identity. The breed of horse, the polish of the coach, the livery of the footman, these were all carefully curated signals of class and refinement. To replace such an elegant setup with a sputtering contraption that coughed oil and rattled like it was falling apart seemed barbaric at first. Many aristocrats sneered, "Why trade my handsome grey gelding for a tin box that smells of petrol?" one might have muttered. But soon enough the tune changed. The car became the new symbol of class, and those who clung stubbornly to carriages risked looking like relics of the past. The real shock lay in how quickly horses lost their dominance. In the 1890s, London alone had hundreds of thousands of working horses. They hauled cabs, omnibuses, and delivery wagons, covering the city with a constant stream of hoofbeats and, of course, mountains of manure. Yet by the 1910s, the motor car had already begun pushing them aside. City planners started imagining a world without horses, no more stables on every street, no more endless piles of waste to shovel, and no more horses bolting at the sight of something shiny. In just a generation, centuries of horse-powered culture evaporated. For coachmen and carriage makers, the shift was disastrous. Whole industries that had thrived for centuries faced extinction almost overnight. Imagine being a craftsman who had spent his life perfecting ornate wooden wheels, only to discover your clients now wanted rubber tyres and engines. Stable boys, grooms, blacksmiths all suddenly found their jobs threatened by the arrival of the motor. It was a form of industrial revolution on four wheels. And then there were the drivers. A carriage driver needed oats for his horses, a whip for control, and strong arms for long hours of travel. A chauffeur, on the other hand, needed petrol, oil, and enough mechanical skill to prevent the car from turning into an expensive paperweight. The contrast was stark. Carriage driver requirements: feed horse, brush horse, don't fall asleep on reins. Chauffeur requirements: understand gears, clean spark plugs, change tyres in the mud, and smile politely while your aristocratic employer pretended to understand car talk. As one wag of the era might have joked, your driver no longer needed oats, just petrol and far fewer bathroom breaks. The cultural shock went deeper than jobs and mechanics. Horses had personalities, quirks, and the occasional bad day. They were living beings, and people built bonds with them. The motor car, on the other hand, was cold, metallic, and unpredictable in its own way. It didn't neigh when it was hungry. It simply refused to start. Instead of bonding with your horses, you bonded with your mechanic. One was furry and loyal, the other charged by the hour. Not everyone welcomed this. Farmers complained that cars spooked their horses. City dwellers feared the noise, and some moralists argued that speeding vehicles were a threat to society's dignity. Editorials appeared in newspapers warning that cars were ruining the peace of the countryside. Even worse, critics claimed, they encouraged laziness. Why walk or ride when you could sit back while a machine did the work? To Edwardian traditionalists, the car symbolized decline. To enthusiasts, it symbolized the dawn of something greater. The irony was that the motor car and the carriage overlapped for years, producing a kind of absurd coexistence. Imagine a wide Edwardian avenue. On one side, an elegant horse-drawn landau carrying a duchess to tea. On the other, a smoky Daimler rattling along, scattering pigeons and alarming every groom in sight. It must have felt like 2 centuries had collided on the same street. To the Duchess, the motorist was an uncouth show-off. To the motorist, the Duchess was stuck in the mud, literally. The deeper story here is that the car didn't just replace the carriage, it changed how people thought about movement. With a horse, you accepted slowness. A journey from London to Brighton might take the better part of a day. With a car, that same trip could be cut dramatically. Travel became not just quicker but more unpredictable. You could now go when you wanted, without worrying about the stamina of your animals. That sense of freedom was intoxicating to Edwardians who lived for display and novelty. By the end of the Edwardian era, the horse-drawn carriage was still around, of course, especially for ceremonies, parades, and the occasional stubborn aristocrat. But the writing was on the wall, or more accurately, the tyre tracks were on the road. The motor car had arrived, and there was no turning back. It wasn't simply a matter of practicality. It was about identity, progress, and social standing. To cling to carriages was to cling to the past. To embrace the motor car was to declare yourself modern, fashionable, and unafraid of the future. The cultural whiplash was real, but for those who could afford it, the thrill outweighed the shock. When the motor car first rattled onto Britain's roads, it wasn't British-made machines that turned heads, it was imports. France and Germany dominated the early automobile market, leaving the proud British elite in the odd position of looking across the channel for their status symbols. For a nation that once measured success in battles won against its continental rivals, this was a peculiar twist of fate. Or, as one wag might put it, Britons adored French cars. It's the only time in history they happily surrendered to France. To understand why, you need to look at the early automotive industry. By the late 19th century, France was the undisputed epicenter of innovation in motoring. French inventors like Émile Levasseur and Armand Peugeot were pushing technology forward at a breathtaking pace. They weren't tinkering in sheds for a hobby. They were creating entire companies dedicated to manufacturing cars. French streets became test tracks for these contraptions, and Paris soon gained a reputation as the world capital of motoring. Germany, meanwhile, had its own mechanical visionaries, Karl Benz and Gottlieb Daimler, whose names still adorn cars today. The Germans brought an engineer's discipline to the game, engines that were powerful, designs that were sturdy, and machines that impressed even the skeptical. While Britain was still debating whether cars were a nuisance to livestock, German engineers were already bolting together vehicles that looked like the future. For Edwardian elites, the choice was clear. If you wanted the finest, the most fashionable, the machine that made people's monocles pop out with envy, you didn't buy British, you imported. A car from Peugeot or Renault was not just a car, it was a declaration. You were plugged into the latest European trends, modern enough to look beyond your own island, and rich enough to afford the astronomical shipping costs. The irony is that Britain had been the cradle of so much of the Industrial Revolution. Trains, steam engines, shipbuilding. Britain had led the world, yet when it came to cars, the country fell behind. Early British laws didn't help. For years, the infamous Red Flag Act required motor vehicles to be preceded by a man waving a red flag to warn pedestrians. That didn't exactly inspire a culture of daring innovation. By the time Britain loosened its restrictions, France and Germany had already sped ahead, literally. The effect on culture was striking. If you strolled down Park Lane in 1905, the glittering motor cars parked outside grand hotels were overwhelmingly foreign. French models like the Panhard or Renault were favourites of the ultra-rich. German Daimlers, meanwhile, earned a reputation for reliability and power, qualities that appealed to wealthy men who liked to pretend they were technically minded, while their chauffeur did the actual work. There was also a dash of romance in buying French. Paris was the beating heart of high culture in this era. French cuisine, French fashion, French art, everything chic carried a Parisian stamp. So why not cars too? For an Edwardian aristocrat, pulling up to a ball in a French Renault was the mechanical equivalent of wearing a Parisian gown or sipping champagne. It wasn't just transportation, it was cultural currency. And while Germany didn't have Paris's glamour, it had something else: engineering prestige. The same country that had given the world Beethoven and Bismarck now offered Daimler and Benz. A German car whispered of precision, efficiency, and understated power. It was less flamboyant than a French model, but it carried its own authority. In short, if France sold you flair, Germany sold you reliability. Both options were irresistible to Edwardians, with money to burn. Of course, this reliance on imports did not go unnoticed. British pride smarted. Here was the richest empire on earth, ruling colonies across the globe, and yet its dukes and earls were spending fortunes on French and German machines. Newspapers sometimes complained about the lack of a homegrown industry. British manufacturers did exist, companies like Napier and Wolseley, but they struggled to match the panache of their continental rivals. An imported car was simply more fashionable, and in Edwardian society fashion was half the point. The logistics of importing these cars also became a spectacle in itself. Crated up in ports, hoisted onto ships, and carefully delivered across the channel, they arrived like exotic treasures. Watching a gleaming French Renault roll out onto an English dock must have been like seeing a thoroughbred horse disembark from a royal barge, equal parts drama and expense, and the owners loved it. They could brag not only about owning a car, but about its continental pedigree. It was the automotive equivalent of announcing that your diamonds came straight from Paris or your cigars from Havana. This dependence on imports also shaped Edwardian car culture in a unique way. British car clubs often revolved around these foreign machines, with members comparing models, boasting about upgrades, and trading horror stories about maintenance. To drive an imported car was to place yourself in a circle of elite insiders. It was a small world of privilege where the roads themselves became runways for showing off European engineering. And while the ordinary Briton might grumble about noisy foreign machines scaring their cows, the elite revelled in the glamour. They didn't care if the car sputtered or broke down, they cared that it was French, German, and most importantly, not British. Because in Edwardian high society, nothing demonstrated wealth and modernity quite like a little continental flair. So, the Edwardian obsession with imported cars was never just about technology. It was about culture, identity, and the eternal urge to outshine one's neighbour. To drive a Renault or Daimler wasn't simply to move, it was to make a statement. And perhaps the most Edwardian part of all, the louder the car, the more noticeable the statement. If you thought Edwardian cars were simply noisy toys on wheels, you'd be right, but they were also ruinously expensive noisy toys on wheels. In an era when a decent housemaid earned around £20 a year, the cost of an automobile could climb into the hundreds or even thousands of pounds. To put that in perspective, the money it took to buy one car could easily have hired an entire household staff, paid for their uniforms, and still left enough left over to stock the wine cellar. Buying a car wasn't a purchase, it was a declaration that you had so much money you could set some of it on fire just for the thrill of speed. When Edwardian aristocrats flipped through catalogues of Daimlers, Renaults or Napiers, they weren't looking at prices, they were looking at status. These machines were priced with surgical precision, high enough to exclude anyone but the ultra-rich, but still within reach of dukes, industrialists and those wealthy enough to not flinch when a mechanic handed them a repair bill the size of a Shakespeare folio. For example, in the early 1900s, a basic motor car might set you back £300 to £500, a staggering sum at the time. A more luxurious model with extra horsepower, leather upholstery and a nameplate impressive enough to make neighbours choke on their tea could soar to £1,000 or more. Meanwhile, an Edwardian house in a respectable part of town could be purchased for a similar figure. So when you drove a car, you weren't just showing that you had money, you were effectively driving your second house down the road, minus the roof, and with much less stability. And then came the hidden costs. The car itself was just the beginning. You also needed a chauffeur, preferably one who wore gloves, goggles, and an expression that suggested he could wrestle an engine back to life with nothing but a wrench and sheer willpower. Chauffeurs were expensive, and unless you had some mechanical skill yourself, and most aristocrats most certainly did not, you couldn't manage without one. Then there was maintenance. Early cars were not the reliable beasts we know today. They broke down constantly, demanded regular tinkering, and devoured spare parts like a spoiled child devours sweets. Tyres punctured with alarming regularity, engines coughed themselves into silence, and everything required oil, grease, and attention. A single long drive might leave you stranded 3 times, each incident resulting in a repair bill that made your bank manager sweat. Let's not forget the petrol. You couldn't simply pop into a petrol station, those were barely beginning to exist. Instead, you bought petrol in tins or barrels, often at inflated prices. Imagine paying high sums for fuel you had to haul home like a crate of wine, only to pour it into your motor car with trembling hands, hoping you didn't set fire to the driveway. Insurance, also expensive. Taxes, the government was quick to recognize that these shiny machines made excellent targets for revenue. Soon, the very act of owning a car meant you were helping fund the state. Another subtle reminder that your wealth was too visible to ignore. And of course, the final cost was social. Buying a motor car meant you instantly invited scrutiny from your peers. If your model wasn't up to date, you were mocked. If your chauffeur was clumsy, you were ridiculed. If your car broke down in front of the wrong people, the humiliation could linger longer than the smell of petrol. It wasn't just about affording the car, it was about affording the continuous cycle of keeping up appearances. Yet this was precisely the point. Edwardian society thrived on competitive spending. If your neighbour had just installed electric lighting, you installed a ballroom chandelier with twice the wattage. If he had built a conservatory, you built an orangery. And if he had bought a motor car, well, you couldn't possibly be seen arriving in a horse-drawn carriage like a medieval relic. You had to buy one too, preferably a more expensive one, with shinier fittings and a louder horn. The sheer extravagance of cars made them the ultimate flex. Trains and bicycles were affordable to ordinary people, but cars were not. That exclusivity was exactly what made them attractive. For the Edwardian elite, expense wasn't a drawback, it was the very essence of the car's charm. The higher the price, the sharper the envy, and envy was half the fun. Imagine rolling up to a country estate, your motor car gleaming in the sunlight, your chauffeur dismounting to open the door with practiced flourish. Guests whispered about the cost, farmers glared at the noise, children stared wide-eyed, and your enemies, the people you desperately wanted to impress and irritate at the same time, were left silently calculating whether their fortune could stretch to something similar. Of course, even for the wealthy, the bill stung. Many Edwardians joked that buying a car was like buying a second marriage, expensive, unpredictable, and guaranteed to drain your finances. But they paid anyway, because in this world, not having a car wasn't an option. It was better to endure the costs than to endure the embarrassment of being left behind. Or, as one could sum it up, buying a car meant you could afford not just speed, but also the repairs, the chauffeur, and the polite envy of your enemies. If you were a wealthy Edwardian, buying a car was only half the performance. The other half came with hiring the man who would actually drive it, the chauffeur. For while motor cars promised speed, style, and social cachet, they also promised endless mechanical disasters. Very few aristocrats had the faintest clue how to operate one of these new contraptions, let alone how to fix it when smoke began pouring from the bonnet. Thus the chauffeur was born, part driver, part mechanic, part personal butler on wheels. A good chauffeur was as much an accessory as the car itself. He was expected to look the part, crisp uniform, leather gloves, heavy goggles, and ideally, a waxed mustache that could withstand high winds. His presence at the wheel announced not only that you owned a car, but that you were wealthy enough to afford someone else to wrestle with its bad temper. After all, if your chauffeur didn't have a waxed mustache and goggles, were you even trying? Unlike carriage drivers who had long been a fixture of aristocratic households, chauffeurs were specialists in a new and mysterious art. They had to understand gears, timing chains, carburetors, and the delicate rituals of coaxing an Edwardian engine into life without it exploding. This gave them an unusual degree of power in elite households. A butler might oversee the wine cellar, but the chauffeur held the keys to the one possession more expensive than the wine cellar itself. This made chauffeurs something of a paradox. On one hand, they were servants, expected to stand quietly, bow politely, and obey commands. On the other, they were indispensable experts. A car without a chauffeur was just an elaborate paperweight, and so many chauffeurs earned a kind of grudging respect from their employers. Aristocrats who wouldn't have dreamed of discussing mechanics with a stable boy suddenly found themselves listening carefully to a chauffeur's opinions on spark plugs. The relationship between owner and chauffeur was a delicate dance. Owners liked to boast about their cars, but most had no idea what was actually under the hood. That was the chauffeur's territory. He was the one who dealt with punctured tyres on muddy roads, who tinkered with stubborn engines in the rain, and who bore the brunt of the frustration when a motor outing turned into an unscheduled picnic by the roadside. Chauffeurs quickly learned to keep their employers calm with a mix of reassurance and impressive-sounding jargon. Yes, sir. Just a minor issue with the magneto coil. Quite routine, I assure you, he'd say, while silently cursing the machine. Hiring a chauffeur was also expensive. Beyond wages, employers were expected to provide a uniform, equipment, and often even housing. Many great country estates built chauffeurs' quarters alongside their new garages, acknowledging that the man was as crucial as the machine he cared for. This raised the chauffeur's status far above the average servant. A footman might polish the silver, but a chauffeur kept a machine worth thousands of pounds humming along the road. In the hierarchy of service, chauffeurs had one thing most other servants lacked: specialised knowledge that their masters did not possess. It wasn't just about practicality, though. The chauffeur added flair to the spectacle of motoring. Imagine pulling up to a party in your gleaming Daimler. The car alone turned heads, but the sight of a uniformed chauffeur stepping down to open the door added an extra layer of theatre. It transformed the moment from a simple arrival into a staged performance of wealth. The hostess might glance at your car, but she'd also take note of your chauffeur's immaculate gloves and posture. Appearances mattered, and so did the man behind the wheel. Some chauffeurs even became minor celebrities in their own right. Early motor races occasionally highlighted professional drivers who, when not competing, worked as chauffeurs for wealthy employers. Hiring a man with racing experience added prestige. Your chauffeur wasn't just competent, he was practically a daredevil. Guests would whisper, "Did you know he once reached 40 miles an hour in France?" while you pretended not to glow with pride. Of course, chauffeurs weren't always loyal or discreet. Diaries and gossip columns hint at romances between chauffeurs and housemaids, or chauffeurs who borrowed the car for unsanctioned joyrides. After all, who could resist the temptation of having a machine worth a fortune at their fingertips? A master might own the car, but in truth, it was the chauffeur who commanded it. If he decided to take a detour, who would know? The Edwardian chauffeur also embodied the era's fascination with modernity. Unlike a butler steeped in centuries-old traditions, a chauffeur was a servant of the future, someone who lived in the hum of engines and the smell of petrol. He was a visible reminder that times were changing, that technology was rewriting social roles in subtle but undeniable ways. In many ways, the chauffeur was the bridge between two worlds, the glittering world of Edwardian wealth and the gritty world of mechanical labour. He had one foot in the garage and one foot in the drawing room, straddling both with a dignity few other servants could claim. And in a society obsessed with appearances, his presence was essential. So when you picture an Edwardian motor outing, don't just imagine the aristocrat reclining in the back seat. Imagine the figure at the wheel, steady hands, polished goggles, moustache catching the breeze. Because the chauffeur wasn't just driving the car, he was driving the entire illusion of modern, effortless wealth. Or put more bluntly, the car may have been expensive, but the chauffeur was priceless. The Edwardians never did anything halfway, least of all fashion. So when the motor car arrived, it wasn't enough simply to own one. You had to look the part. And because early cars were open to the elements, looking the part meant dressing as though you were heading into a dust storm armed with silk, leather, and a firm belief that style mattered more than survival. As one observer put it, you didn't dress for comfort, you dressed like you were going into a stylish sandstorm. In the earliest days of motoring, cars had no roofs, no windshields, and certainly no climate control. The Edwardian elite quickly realised that a drive across town meant not only wind in your hair but dust in your eyes, soot on your clothes, and the occasional insect in your teeth. Ordinary people might have thought, "I'll just wear something old," but this was Edwardian high society, where every inconvenience was an excuse for a new wardrobe. Thus emerged the motoring outfit, a full ensemble designed to protect the delicate aristocrat from the indignities of the open road. Long coats, known as dusters, became the uniform of choice. These were typically made of thick linen or canvas, cut generously so that they could wrap around one's fashionable clothing. A duster wasn't about elegance, it was about sacrifice. It kept your gowns and tailored suits from being ruined by flying mud, though it did make everyone look faintly like they were wearing curtains. But Edwardians being Edwardians, even dusters soon became stylish in their own right. Designers began offering them in chic cuts and with fashionable trims. Wealthy motorists might opt for fur-lined versions in winter, or silk-trimmed ones in summer. Because if you were going to look like you were wearing a giant sack, it had better be the most expensive sack money could buy. Gloves were essential. Steering wheels and levers weren't smooth, polished affairs. They were gritty, oily, and often blister-inducing. Leather gauntlets not only protected the hands but also added a certain dashing air. Male drivers fancied themselves adventurers, gripping the wheel like knights wielding swords. Female passengers, meanwhile, wore their gloves long and elegant, often coordinated with their veils. Ah yes, the veil. No Edwardian motoring ensemble was complete without one. For women, this usually meant a fine gauze or silk veil tied securely over the hat and draped across the face. It kept dust and insects at bay, while allowing just enough visibility to glare disdainfully at pedestrians. Men sometimes wore simpler goggles, but women's veils became a symbol of fashionable motoring femininity. In fact, society gossip sometimes whispered that veils allowed women an unusual freedom. Behind the fabric, one could roll one's eyes, mutter unladylike words about the bumpy road, or even flirt incognito, all without scandal. Hats, of course, were non-negotiable. Edwardian society would rather have tolerated nudity than bare heads, but wearing a feathered hat in an open motor car was a recipe for chaos. One gust of wind and your ostrich plumes became a public nuisance. To solve this, practical motoring hats were designed, sturdy, brimmed, and often paired with elastic or veils to hold them in place. Some women embraced small, close-fitting cloche-style hats long before they became fashionable in the 1920s. The car, in other words, didn't just change how people travelled, it began reshaping headwear trends too. For men, goggles were the centrepiece. There was something irresistibly modern about strapping on a pair of oversized lenses, as if preparing for battle against dust and insects. The larger the goggles, the more heroic the look. Paired with a thick coat and gloves, a gentleman driver resembled nothing so much as a soldier on the front lines of an absurdly stylish war. One fought against gravel and wind. Winter posed new challenges. Open cars offered no protection from the cold, so furs became indispensable. Men wrapped themselves in heavy coats with fur collars, while women bundled up in stoles, muffs and blankets. The sight of a fur-clad lady stepping from a car wasn't just about warmth. It was about making sure everyone knew that her motor outings were every bit as glamorous as her ballroom appearances. What's striking is how quickly this motoring fashion took on its own identity. Within just a few years of cars appearing on British roads, motoring clothes became a category in fashion catalogues. Department stores advertised specialised coats, gloves, hats and veils designed for the adventurous new pastime. It was no longer enough to say, "I own a car." You had to show it through your wardrobe. In some circles, being seen without proper motoring attire was considered almost as scandalous as showing up to a ball without gloves. This obsession with clothing also reinforced the divide between classes. A working-class cyclist might throw on an old jacket against the chill, but Edwardian motorists spent fortunes on tailored coats and imported goggles. To be dressed properly for motoring was to announce that you had money, taste and no intention of suffering discomfort like the rest of humanity. Of course, the entire spectacle could look faintly ridiculous. Passengers bundled head to toe, veils flapping, goggles fogging, and dusters trailing behind them, more like explorers braving the Sahara than socialites on their way to tea. But that was the Edwardian way. Turn necessity into extravagance, and then call it fashion. So the next time you see an old photograph of stiff-backed Edwardians in their early cars, swaddled in veils and heavy coats, don't think of them as overdressed. Think of them as pioneers in a stylish new battlefield, fighting mud, wind and bugs, all while making sure they looked fabulous doing it. Because in the Edwardian era, even the open road demanded couture. If there was one thing that truly made the Edwardian elite giddy with delight, it was speed. The motor car wasn't simply about getting from one place to another, it was about how quickly you could do it and how many people you could terrify in the process. This was an era when trains already carried passengers at respectable velocities, but trains were communal, predictable, and frankly too democratic. Cars offered something entirely different: personal speed, raw velocity, the thrill of wind in your face, and the delicious fear that the entire machine might explode beneath you. It is important to remember that fast, in Edwardian terms, doesn't quite match our modern perspective. In the early 1900s, pushing a car to 30 miles per hour was considered positively reckless. At that pace, passengers clutched their veils, drivers gritted their teeth, and onlookers swore the world was going to end. At 30 miles per hour, Edwardians thought their faces might peel off. Imagine their reaction to the motorway. Why such obsession? Part of it was novelty. For thousands of years, human beings had been limited by muscle power, be it their own or a horse's. The motor car broke that ancient barrier. Suddenly, a machine could propel you faster than any galloping steed, and it didn't even need feeding or resting. This was intoxicating, particularly to wealthy men who had grown up measuring their virility by the size of their stables or the swiftness of their hunters. Now, horsepower came in the form of combustion, and the race was on to see who could go faster. Public fascination with speed manifested in countless ways. Newspapers breathlessly reported on new records, treating each additional mile per hour as though it were a conquest equal to discovering a new continent. A daring driver reaching 40 miles per hour was celebrated as a hero, while nervous pedestrians wondered if civilization itself could survive such recklessness. Cartoonists had a field day, drawing caricatures of wide-eyed motorists hanging onto the wheel as their hats and moustaches streamed behind them like banners. The wealthy, naturally, turned speed into a form of competition. Gentlemen challenged each other to impromptu races down country lanes, turning sleepy villages into obstacle courses. There were tales of cars roaring past startled farmers, scattering chickens and sheep in their wake, while horrified constables tried in vain to enforce speed limits that were already laughably outdated. The law might have insisted on 12 miles per hour in certain areas, but to the Edwardian speed enthusiast, that was walking pace. Racing circuits soon emerged to formalise the obsession. The Brooklands track in Surrey, opened in 1907, became a temple of velocity. Built with sweeping banked curves, it allowed drivers to push their cars to limits unimaginable on public roads. The elite flocked there, not just to drive, but to watch. It became a fashionable outing, with spectators dressed in their motoring best, sipping champagne as they marvelled at the daring fools roaring past in machines that looked alarmingly fragile. Speed also carried a strong dose of machismo. Young men, eager to prove their daring, treated fast driving as a form of ritual. The louder the engine, the faster the wheels, the greater the glory. Women, too, became caught up in the craze, shocking traditionalists who believed ladies should not risk their delicate constitutions at such outrageous speeds. Yet some women not only rode along but drove themselves, creating a sensation. Seeing a woman behind the wheel of a car flying at 30 miles per hour was enough to make Edwardian gentlemen gasp into their brandy. Of course, with speed came accidents, and with accidents came drama. Early cars lacked the safety features we take for granted. No seat belts, no airbags, and braking systems that might generously be described as optimistic. A sharp turn taken too quickly could result in disaster, and the newspapers gleefully reported on every crash involving the wealthy. Tales of peers of the realm careening into hedges or dukes flipping their machines into ditches provided both scandal and schadenfreude. Yet the danger only added to the allure. Driving fast wasn't simply about movement, it was about flirting with risk, proving one's courage, and embracing the modern spirit of progress. For an Edwardian speed enthusiast, each journey wasn't just travel, it was an adventure, an assertion that they belonged to a generation breaking free from the slow plod of the past. This obsession also bled into broader culture. Artists painted scenes of gleaming cars racing across landscapes, their blurred wheels symbolising modern dynamism. Writers described the exhilaration of speed as though it were a new drug, one that elevated the soul. Even politicians occasionally weighed in, alternately condemning reckless driving or praising it as evidence of national vigour. The irony, of course, is that many of these speed demons still relied on their chauffeurs to handle the tricky mechanics. But that didn't matter. Sitting in the back seat of a car tearing along at 25 miles per hour still made one feel like a pioneer. It was as much about the perception of daring as the reality. Ultimately, the Edwardian speed craze was about more than numbers on a dial. It was about redefining what it meant to be modern. The car, with its rattling engine and potential for danger, offered a taste of the future, one that was noisy, fast, and thrillingly unpredictable. And while 30 miles per hour might not impress us today, to Edwardians it was nothing short of breathtaking, a glimpse of a world rushing forward, leaving the past in the dust. If Edwardians loved speed on country lanes, they adored speed on a grand stage. The early motor races weren't simply competitions of mechanical power, they were glittering spectacles where high society gathered to see and be seen. It was the perfect Edwardian cocktail: danger, glamour, innovation, and a chance to one-up your rivals in front of an audience. As one wag might put it, it wasn't about who won, it was about who looked the most fashionable while nearly dying. The Gordon Bennett Cup, first run in 1900, became one of the defining events of the Edwardian motoring craze, named after the wealthy American publisher James Gordon Bennett Jr., a man whose name was practically synonymous with extravagance. It was more than a race. It was a battle for prestige. Nations competed not just for speed, but for honour. To ensure the drama, each car had to be painted in national racing colours: British green, French blue, German white, Italian red. Thus was born the iconic British racing green, which still stirs the hearts of enthusiasts today. The races themselves were gruelling affairs, held on long open road courses. Drivers battled not only their rivals, but also dust, stones, breakdowns, and the occasional wandering cow. Spectators lined the routes in their thousands, squinting through the haze as cars thundered past, each driver cloaked in clouds of dust like some industrial-age knight. Crashes were frequent, injuries common, but that only heightened the appeal. To Edwardians, this wasn't madness, it was modernity in action, and naturally, the elite flocked to watch. Aristocrats, industrialists, and royals packed picnic baskets, donned their finest motoring attire, and travelled to races as if heading for Ascot. It was less about the competition and more about the occasion. One might murmur politely about the impressive speed of the Renault team, then turn immediately to gossip about Lady So-and-so's outrageous new hat. The motor race became the new society stage, where appearances mattered just as much as results. Then came Brooklands, opened in Surrey in 1907. It was the first purpose-built motor racing circuit in the world. With its dramatic banked curves and vast spectator stands, Brooklands was a temple to the cult of speed. To drive there was a mark of prestige. To be seen there was a mark of fashion. The track quickly became a haunt of the wealthy, who treated race days as grand social outings. They arrived in their own cars, dressed in their motoring finery, ready to sip champagne while daring drivers risked their lives for glory. The scene at Brooklands was quintessentially Edwardian. Rows of gleaming cars lined up like jewels, their polished brass fittings catching the sunlight. Gentlemen in goggles and heavy coats strode about, exuding an air of heroic nonchalance. Women in dusters and veils posed for photographs, simultaneously protected from dust and showcasing the latest Parisian styles. It was a world where speed and style danced hand in hand, each reinforcing the other. For the drivers themselves, the races were no mere parades. They risked everything for the thrill of victory and the promise of fame. Edwardian race cars were stripped-down machines, terrifyingly fragile by modern standards. Engines overheated, tyres burst, steering wobbled precariously. A single mistake could send a car hurtling into disaster. And yet, the drivers pressed on, earning admiration as daredevils who embodied the restless energy of the age. But to the aristocrats in the stands, the danger was part of the entertainment. A crash elicited gasps and murmurs, followed by hurried discussions over sandwiches and champagne. The possibility of catastrophe gave the whole event an edge of theatre, a sense that one was watching history being written at 60 miles per hour. In a society obsessed with novelty and spectacle, racing provided both in abundance. The Gordon Bennett Cup and Brooklands also became venues for national pride. Britain was desperate to prove it could match France and Germany, whose engineering prowess dominated the early races. British cars often lagged behind in performance, but their supporters cheered them with patriotic fervour. When Selwyn Edge drove a Napier to victory in the 1902 Gordon Bennett Cup, it wasn't just a win for a man, it was a triumph for the nation, celebrated in newspapers as though he had single-handedly repelled an invasion. Of course, not everyone approved. Moralists tutted about the recklessness, the danger, and the sheer frivolity of it all, but their disapproval only added spice. To attend a motor race was to embrace modernity, to signal that you were part of a daring new world. Watching aristocrats risk their necks in machines of fire and steel became as much a social ritual as attending the opera. What's striking is how quickly these events shaped wider culture. Motoring magazines breathlessly reported on each race, celebrating not only the winners but the fashion, the drama, and the personalities involved. Postcards and souvenirs circulated, bearing images of heroic drivers or gleaming machines. Children dreamed of growing up to race cars. Adults dreamed of affording them. Racing transformed the car from a curiosity into a cultural phenomenon, a machine inseparable from the thrill of speed and the glamour of high society. In truth, for many Edwardians in the stands, the question of who actually won was secondary. What mattered was that you were there, part of the spectacle, sipping champagne as engines roared and dust rose in the air. Because in Edwardian society, racing wasn't just about victory, it was about visibility. Or, to put it bluntly, it wasn't about crossing the finish line first, it was about crossing it in style. For Edwardians, the motor car wasn't merely a machine, it was a social passport, and what better way to turn a noisy new invention into a respectable pastime than by wrapping it in the velvet curtains of exclusivity. Thus was born the Automobile Club of Great Britain, founded in 1897, and later granted the Royal Seal of Approval. More than a group of car enthusiasts, it was a social club where prestige mattered as much as horsepower, or, as one might quip, these clubs were less about engines and more about sipping brandy while pretending you understood carburetors. The Automobile Club began modestly, a gathering of a few forward-thinking motorists who wanted to exchange tips and promote the interests of the new machine. But almost immediately it became clear that this was not destined to be an everyman's club. Membership fees were steep, the requirements were selective, and the atmosphere was unmistakably elite. Within a few years, the club had blossomed into a fashionable institution, attracting aristocrats, industrialists, and gentlemen of leisure who saw in the automobile not just a pastime, but a way to reassert their dominance in a rapidly changing world. The club's headquarters in London was designed to be as much about comfort as utility. Members lounged in plush chairs, cigars in hand, while discussing road tests they had not actually performed and mechanical terms they half understood. The rooms were stocked with maps, guides, and journals, but they also featured bars, billiard tables, and dining rooms that made the place more akin to a gentleman's club than a garage. The motor car might have been messy, greasy, and unpredictable, but in the club it was sanitized into a symbol of refinement. What made membership so vital was its exclusivity. To belong to the Automobile Club was to announce that you were not just rich enough to buy a car, you were refined enough to join the circle of men who defined what motoring meant. The club held dinners, organised lectures, and sponsored races, all while ensuring that its events carried the sheen of high society. It was less about tinkering with engines, and more about ensuring that car ownership retained its aura of distinction. Practicality was there too, of course. The club advocated for motorists' rights, lobbying the government to ease restrictive laws, improve road surfaces, and establish rules of the road. In an era when angry farmers still shook their fists at speeding cars and constables handed out fines for reckless driving at 20 mile Paris, the Automobile Club acted as a shield for the elite. Its members didn't just buy cars, they bought influence, ensuring that the laws bent, or at least tilted politely in their favour. But if lobbying was the club's official purpose, networking was its unofficial one. Here, industrial magnates could compare cars like they compared estates, while young aristocrats boasted about their daring drives across the countryside. The conversations were peppered with technical jargon, most of it vague, but the point wasn't accuracy, it was authority. Saying I find the carburetor temperamental in damp weather sounded infinitely better than admitting I have no idea what that metal box does, but my chauffeur looks worried. The club also provided a stage for display. Annual dinners became lavish affairs, where members arrived in their gleaming cars to park them ostentatiously outside. Newspapers occasionally reported on these gatherings, emphasizing not just the presence of the cars, but the presence of dukes, earls, and captains of industry. To be a member was to belong to the vanguard of modernity, even if you never once turned a spanner yourself. Brooklands, that great racing circuit, became another extension of the club's prestige. The Automobile Club organised races, sanctioned competitions, and ensured that members always had the best seats from which to view the excitement. It was less about grease and grit, more about champagne and spectacle. A car breaking a speed record mattered, of course, but so did the hat you wore while applauding it. In 1907, the Automobile Club of Great Britain received a royal charter, becoming the Royal Automobile Club, RAC. This elevated it from a fashionable gathering to an institution recognised at the highest level. If it hadn't already been exclusive enough, the royal seal confirmed it. Motoring was no longer a fringe hobby. It was respectable, aristocratic, and woven into the fabric of British high society. For those outside the circle, the club represented yet another reminder that the motor car was not for everyone. While ordinary people might save for years to buy a modest second-hand vehicle, the Automobile Club was where men casually discussed importing their third Daimler. The gulf between the classes was written not just in the cost of the cars, but in the leather armchairs of the club rooms. And yet, for all its seriousness, there was something faintly comical about it too. One can picture a group of mustachioed Edwardians swirling brandy, solemnly discussing road performance, while their chauffeurs, the men who actually knew what they were talking about, waited outside polishing the brass fittings. The Automobile Club was, in many ways, less about cars themselves, and more about ensuring that the ownership of cars remained a marker of privilege. It worked. By the end of the Edwardian era, membership was considered essential for any gentleman with a motor car. The club had cemented itself as the arbiter of what it meant to be a motorist, shaping not just laws and races, but the very culture of motoring itself. Because in Edwardian Britain, driving wasn't just about the road, it was about the rooms where men gathered to talk about the road, while someone else did the actual driving. If the Edwardians loved their cars, they had a funny way of showing it, because the one thing Britain did not provide was roads fit for them. Motor cars were supposed to symbolise progress, but in practice they spent much of their time lurching through ruts, grinding along muddy tracks, and jolting over cobblestones that rattled passengers like dice in a cup. In truth, driving was part transportation, part extreme sport, and mostly an excuse to get stuck in a hedge. You have to remember that Britain's roads were designed for horses, carts, and the occasional dignified carriage, not 2-ton petrol machines with rubber tyres. Many roads outside cities were little more than dirt paths subject to every indignity the weather could muster. In summer, they baked hard and cracked. In winter, they turned into rivers of mud. And when it rained, which it often did, they combined both qualities, producing a surface that could swallow wheels and ruin shoes in a single outing. Potholes were more like craters. Ruts left by heavy wagons could trap car wheels, forcing chauffeurs to wrestle with steering until their knuckles whitened. In rural areas, hedges grew so close that cars scraped against branches, and puddles disguised dangers deep enough to drown a small dog. For wealthy Edwardians who expected elegance and ease, the reality of the open road came as a shock. It's one thing to imagine yourself a pioneer of modernity. It's another to arrive at tea splattered in mud, smelling faintly of stagnant water, and explaining that your shiny new car is still embedded in a ditch 2 miles back. Cities were hardly better. London's streets had been laid with cobblestones and wooden blocks to accommodate hooves and carriage wheels, not the delicate tyres of motor cars. Driving over them turned every trip into a bone-rattling ordeal. Dust was another issue. On dry days, cars kicked up great clouds, choking pedestrians and leaving everything coated in a fine grey film. Picture aristocrats in immaculate white gloves arriving at the opera, only to discover those gloves now looked like they had been used to sweep a chimney. Then there were the hazards of sharing the road. Horses still dominated traffic, and they did not take kindly to cars. The sight, or worse, the sound of a motor car often sent them bolting, much to the fury of their owners. Drivers and cyclists also had to contend with these new machines, which came hurtling along far faster than traditional traffic. To many Edwardians, the motor car was less a vehicle and more a mobile nuisance, terrifying the old world while failing to thrive in the new. The government was slow to adapt. While France and Germany began investing in motor-friendly infrastructure, Britain lagged behind. Local councils were responsible for road upkeep, but many were reluctant to spend heavily on improvements that seemed to benefit only the wealthy elite. Why pour funds into smoothing lanes for dukes and industrialists when ordinary villagers still relied on horses and bicycles? As a result, cars remained largely at war with the terrain. Motoring associations began lobbying fiercely for better roads. The Automobile Club of Great Britain, later the RA, argued that smoother, wider surfaces would benefit everyone. Cars, carriages, cyclists and pedestrians alike. Pamphlets circulated warning that Britain risked falling behind the continent if its infrastructure didn't improve. Some Edwardians even spoke of a road crisis, a phrase that sounded dramatic until you realised just how much time people were spending stuck axle-deep in mud. Improvisation became part of the motoring experience. Chauffeurs carried shovels and planks ready to dig out wheels or create makeshift bridges over ditches. Spare tyres were essential, not because punctures were occasional, but because they were guaranteed. Wealthy families embarking on motoring tours often brought along entire support crews, ready to push, pull and repair as needed. A journey advertised as 2 hours might stretch into 6, complete with unscheduled picnics while the chauffeur swore at the engine and the road. This hostility between cars and roads even influenced how cars were built. Early Edwardian vehicles often had high ground clearance to navigate ruts, and some manufacturers emphasized the toughness of their designs in advertisements. Buyers were promised cars capable of conquering any road, though the fine print didn't mention that this conquest often ended with 3 men and a horse dragging the car back to solid ground. Despite all this, there was a perverse charm to the ordeal. For the elite, bad roads added to the sense of adventure. Driving wasn't just about going places, it was about proving you could overcome adversity, even if that adversity was an uncooperative country lane. Motorists told stories of daring escapes from mud holes, near misses with hedges, and heroic moments when their car actually made it up a hill without stalling. These anecdotes became social currency, retold over brandy as evidence of one's modern spirit. Eventually, of course, improvements came. The rise of motor cars forced councils to reconsider their surfaces. Tarred roads began appearing, offering smoother, dust-free rides. But in the Edwardian years, such roads were rare luxuries. For most motorists, the dream of motoring collided daily with the grimy reality of Britain's infrastructure. So when you picture an Edwardian car gliding gracefully along a leafy lane, adjust that image. Imagine instead a mud-splattered machine shuddering over potholes, aristocrats clinging to their hats, and a chauffeur muttering that he should have stayed in the stables. That was the real Edwardian road experience, equal parts frustration, farce, and a hint of progress struggling through the mud. Because before the age of smooth highways, every drive was an adventure, whether you liked it or not. Owning an Edwardian car wasn't just about speed, style, or showing off your chauffeur's mustache. It was also about fuel, where to find it, how to transport it, and how to keep your shiny new toy from sputtering to a halt in the middle of nowhere. Today, we glide into petrol stations every few miles, swipe a card and fill up in minutes. For the Edwardians, things were a little more chaotic. To put it bluntly, you didn't fill up at a station, you bought petrol in cans, like you were fueling a very angry lawnmower. At the dawn of the motor age, petrol wasn't a common household product. Kerosene was widely used for lamps, coal for heating and gas for lighting. But petrol, still often called motor spirit, was an odd byproduct of refining, useful mainly for cleaning and the occasional mechanical experiment. Then along came cars, which turned it into the lifeblood of modernity. Unfortunately, there was no infrastructure to get it to motorists. Early drivers faced an absurd challenge: where to buy the stuff. In Britain, your best bet was often the local chemist's shop. Yes, the same place you went to buy cough syrup or castor oil also stocked tins of highly flammable liquid, which they would hand over with only slightly raised eyebrows. A trip to the pharmacy for motor spirit was a regular ritual for chauffeurs, who would lug away cans that sloshed ominously and leaked if you looked at them the wrong way. The image of a liveried driver standing politely in line between someone buying cough drops and another buying hair tonic is one of the great absurdities of the age. Other suppliers included hardware shops, bicycle sellers, and in some cases, inns along major routes. Petrol was sold in 2-gallon cans, each sturdy enough to double as a blunt weapon in case of highway robbery. Drivers stacked these cans in the back of the car or strapped them precariously to the running boards. It made the average Edwardian motor outing look less like a pleasure trip and more like a military expedition, complete with fuel reserves rattling at every turn. The chaos didn't end there. Different suppliers sold petrol under brand names like Pratt's Motor Spirit or Shell Spirit, but there was no guarantee of consistency. Quality varied wildly, and some unlucky motorists found their engines coughing indignantly on fuel that was more dirt than spirit. Mechanics joked that half their work came from bad petrol, while the other half came from chauffeurs pretending bad petrol was the problem. Storage was another nightmare. Wealthy motorists who wanted to be prepared often kept barrels of petrol on their estates. This, of course, turned their garages into fire hazards of the highest order. Imagine a grand Edwardian country house with servants polishing silver in one wing, while in the outbuildings hundreds of gallons of volatile liquid sat sweating in the sun. One careless spark could have transformed half the aristocracy into a cautionary tale. For those daring enough to attempt long tours, fuel planning was practically an art form. Routes had to be charted not just for scenery, but for supply points. Chauffeurs memorized where the next chemist or cooperative supplier might be found, often phoning ahead if a telephone existed nearby to make sure cans were available. Running out of petrol was not just inconvenient, it was humiliating. Nothing deflated the glamour of motoring faster than being passed by a farmer's cart while you stood roadside furiously shaking an empty can. The scarcity also shaped the economics of motoring. Petrol was expensive compared to traditional fuels, and the inconvenience of acquiring it reinforced the exclusivity of car ownership. If you could afford not only the car but the endless stream of cans required to keep it running, you were clearly in the highest echelon of society. For the Edwardian elite, inconvenience wasn't a deterrent. It was part of the appeal. Ordinary people couldn't dream of fussing with petrol cans. That was precisely the point. Slowly, companies began to see opportunity in this chaos. Pratt's, Anglo-American Oil, and others began setting up depots while Shell imported fuel in bulk from Borneo and Sumatra, branding it with a memorable scallop shell logo. Even so, the petrol station as we know it barely existed before the First World War. The first true roadside filling stations in Britain wouldn't appear until the 1920s. In the Edwardian years, fuel remained a scavenger hunt. The absurdity of this early system often provided comic relief. Stories circulated of chauffeurs rushing into shops mid-journey, breathlessly asking for motor spirit, only to be offered peppermint lozenges instead. Others described aristocrats sheepishly waiting by the roadside as their chauffeur trudged to the nearest village for a can. Sometimes the chauffeur returned by bicycle, balancing petrol precariously in his basket, grimacing at the indignity of it all. Yet for all its inconvenience, there was romance in this petrol panic. Each outing carried the thrill of uncertainty. Would the car make it to the next stop? Or would you be stranded watching sheep graze while your chauffeur negotiated with a bemused shopkeeper? The unpredictability turned motoring into an adventure, and for the Edwardian elite, adventure was half the fun. In time, of course, petrol would become as ubiquitous as bread and tea. But in the Edwardian years, it was a luxury as rare and precious as the cars themselves. To fuel your machine was to announce not only your wealth but your resourcefulness. After all, anyone could hire a carriage, but it took a special kind of determination to lug half a dozen cans of volatile liquid across the countryside, just to enjoy the thrill of driving at 30 miles an hour. So next time you curse the price of petrol at a modern pump, spare a thought for the Edwardians. At least you don't have to queue at the chemist and leave with enough explosive tins to frighten the neighbours. For all their glamour, Edwardian cars were not known for safety. In fact, early motorists spent almost as much time in ditches as they did on roads. Cars had no seatbelts, no traffic lights to guide them, and brakes that worked mainly as a polite suggestion. Driving one was an act of daring, and sometimes folly, that could end with a triumphant arrival at a country house or with aristocrats dusting themselves off beside an overturned machine. And when those accidents involved the rich, the newspapers pounced. Because, as Edwardian journalists understood, if you ran over a chicken, it was tragic. If you ran over a duke, it was history. Accidents were inevitable given the conditions. Roads were poor, cars were temperamental, and drivers, especially wealthy amateurs, were often clueless. Steering mechanisms were stiff, visibility was limited, and engines had the unnerving habit of stalling at critical moments. Throw in the chaos of pedestrians, cyclists, horses, and the occasional stray cow, and every journey became a gamble. You might make it to your destination in style, or you might make the headlines for all the wrong reasons. And oh, how the press adored these stories. Newspapers in the Edwardian era were hungry for sensation, and motor accidents provided it in spades. Accounts of crashes were written with the same relish reserved for scandals and royal gossip. Readers couldn't get enough of tales describing titled gentlemen losing control of their automobiles and landing in ponds, or wealthy ladies being rescued from ditches by bewildered farmers. For the working classes, there was more than a little schadenfreude in seeing the elite humbled by their own expensive toys. Fatalities weren't uncommon either. Cars could easily reach speeds of 30 to 40 mph, and at those velocities, collisions were deadly. Pedestrians were especially vulnerable. Many had never encountered a vehicle that moved faster than a horse, and their instincts betrayed them. Stepping into the road without looking could be fatal. Early statistics from the 1900s show rising numbers of deaths linked to cars, and while the absolute figures were small compared to later eras, the impact was enormous. Each accident was magnified by its novelty and its shock value. Even minor incidents caused uproar. A motorist splashing mud on a lady's dress might find himself cursed in the press the next day. A chicken run down on a village road could inspire furious letters to editors, demanding stricter regulations. The car wasn't just a machine, it was a lightning rod for debates about class, technology, and the risks of progress. For the wealthy, accidents carried a double sting: physical danger and social embarrassment. Imagine the horror of a baroness who, on the way to a garden party, found her car toppled into a hedge. Not only was she shaken and covered in dust, but her humiliation might be immortalized in the next day's papers. Gossip spread faster than cars ever could, and aristocrats quickly realized that while driving made them modern, crashing made them ridiculous. Some accidents, however, took on legendary proportions. In 1903, for instance, Émile Levasseur's tragic crash during the Paris-Madrid race shocked the motoring world. In Britain, high-profile deaths among the gentry stoked public outcry. Each headline reinforced the perception that cars were dangerous toys for the rich, unsuited to the common road. Cartoonists lampooned motorists as reckless maniacs, painting them as moustached villains mowing down everything in sight. This negative publicity had political consequences. As crashes mounted, so did calls for regulation. Speed limits were debated fiercely, and licensing systems began to take shape. Magistrates handed out fines for furious driving, a phrase that made cars sound more like angry bulls than mechanical vehicles. Some towns even posted constables with stopwatches to catch speeding motorists, a primitive but earnest attempt to tame the chaos. Yet the accidents also added to the mystique of motoring. Danger was part of the appeal. For some Edwardians, the idea that driving carried genuine risk made it even more thrilling. Surviving a wild drive down a country lane gave one bragging rights in the smoking room, while appearing in the society pages after a dramatic crash could perversely boost one's reputation. After all, if you had to crash, better to do it in style and in full view of your peers. The press also began to romanticize drivers as tragic heroes. When wealthy young men died in crashes, obituaries framed them as martyrs to modernity, brave souls who had dared to embrace the future. These narratives glossed over the fact that many of them had simply failed to take a corner. But in a society fascinated by progress, even disaster could be spun as noble. For ordinary people, though, the accidents reinforced resentment. Many saw cars as invasive, noisy, and lethal intruders. When a motorist struck a pedestrian or frightened horses into bolting, it wasn't viewed as a freak event. It was taken as proof that cars were inherently menacing. Villagers jeered at stranded motorists, cheered when they were fined, and eagerly consumed every sensational headline that cast the rich as reckless menaces. Still, the accidents didn't slow the craze. If anything, they accelerated demands for better roads, safer designs, and clearer rules. Over time, crashes shifted from scandal to grim statistic. But in the Edwardian years, each one was a front-page drama, complete with hand-wringing editorials and gleeful gossip. So, while motoring offered freedom and speed, it also brought with it a darker truth. Cars could kill. And though that truth would become all too familiar in the 20th century, in Edwardian Britain it was still shocking, scandalous, and for the press at least, profitable. Because whether it was a chicken or a duke, the motorcar had an uncanny ability to turn accidents into headlines. When cars first rattled and coughed their way onto British roads, lawmakers had little idea what to do with them. They weren't horses, they weren't trains, and they certainly weren't bicycles. They were noisy, fast, unpredictable, and occasionally on fire. For a government more accustomed to legislating over cab fares and chimney sweeps, the motor car was a nightmare wrapped in brass fittings. Regulations had to be invented almost from scratch, and they often looked like desperate attempts to keep pedestrians alive. Or, as one could put it, speed limits were introduced because apparently pedestrians enjoyed surviving. At the dawn of motoring, Britain already had laws for self-propelled vehicles, dating back to the mid-19th century. These early rules included the notorious Red Flag Act of 1865, which required a man to walk in front of vehicles waving a flag to warn bystanders. Nothing could have been less compatible with the spirit of Edwardian motoring than creeping along behind a pedestrian with a bit of cloth. Unsurprisingly, the act was repealed by 1896, allowing cars to move at the dizzying speed of 14 miles per hour. Drivers celebrated by holding the Emancipation Run from London to Brighton, gleefully ignoring the fact that most of their cars broke down en route, but as more cars appeared, so did problems. Speeding aristocrats terrified villagers, ran over chickens, and occasionally killed pedestrians. Public opinion demanded controls. The Motor Car Act of 1903 was Britain's first serious attempt to regulate the new machines. It introduced compulsory driver licensing, a radical idea at the time, number plates, and an official speed limit of 20 mph. Suddenly, motorists were no longer anonymous daredevils. They were accountable daredevils. The license requirement was more symbolic than practical. Drivers simply signed a form and paid a small fee. No tests, no demonstrations of competence, just a certificate that said, in effect, congratulations, you now have the legal right to terrify horses. Still, it marked the beginning of a system we take for granted today. The idea that driving was a privilege granted by the state rather than an unregulated free-for-all was born in the Edwardian era. Number plates were another new concept. Painted in stark white on black, they gave each car an identity. For the first time, angry pedestrians could point at a reckless motorist and complain with evidence. It was number A2437 that splashed mud all over my skirt, became a sentence that could be reported to the authorities. In practice, enforcement was patchy, but the plates helped transform cars from eccentric novelties into recognised road users. Enforcing speed limits proved trickier. Policemen stood at fixed points with stopwatches, timing cars between markers. If you covered the distance too quickly, you were summoned to court. Motorists grumbled that this was unfair, that constables were timing inaccurately, or worse, cheating. Some even accused police of hiding in hedges like highwaymen, leaping out to flag down unsuspecting chauffeurs. The resentment was so strong that motoring groups began funding legal defence funds for members caught speeding. But beneath the grumbling, there was recognition that rules were necessary. The chaos of unregulated motoring was unsustainable. Without laws, accidents would multiply, and public backlash might have killed the craze altogether. The compromise was to allow the elite their toys, while ensuring that pedestrians, cyclists, and farmers could still cross roads without being mowed down. Interestingly, debates about regulation mirrored many modern arguments. Was it the state's job to interfere in personal freedom? Should the wealthy be allowed to drive as fast as they liked on their own land? Were speed limits too low to be practical? Editorials thundered both for and against, while cartoonists gleefully lampooned both reckless drivers and pompous lawmakers. The motor car became a proxy for larger questions about modernity, progress, and class privilege. The law also reached into unexpected corners. Local councils banned cars from certain bridges, fearing vibrations would damage old structures. Some towns restricted motoring hours or imposed special taxes. In a few cases, angry rural communities took matters into their own hands, erecting barriers or even scattering nails on roads to slow down wealthy motorists. Regulation wasn't just top-down, it was grassroots, born of exasperated villagers, unwilling to watch another Sunday outing turn into a stampede. Of course, the wealthy often found ways to sidestep these rules. Having influence meant you could charm or intimidate local authorities, or simply pay the fine and continue roaring through villages at your preferred pace. For aristocrats, a speeding ticket was less a deterrent and more a badge of honour, proof that they had lived boldly. Newspapers sometimes published lists of titled drivers fined for speeding, which perversely made them look glamorous. Despite all the friction, the legal framework laid down in the Edwardian years created the foundations of modern traffic law. Licenses, plates, speed limits, road taxes, all were born out of the chaos of this era. Without them, Britain might have descended into anarchy every time a motorist left the driveway. And yet, Edwardian laws always carried a hint of comedy. Magistrates scolding baronets for furious driving, policemen hiding behind hedgerows with stopwatches, chauffeurs solemnly presenting licenses they'd acquired without so much as touching a steering wheel. These were scenes both ridiculous and revolutionary. The state was trying, often clumsily, to keep up with the machine that was changing the world. So while the Edwardians might laugh at our motorways and traffic cameras, they laid the groundwork. They taught us that progress without rules leads to chaos, and that nothing motivates lawmakers quite like angry villagers and dead chickens. Because in the end, regulation wasn't about stopping the future. It was about making sure the future didn't flatten you on its way through town. In a society obsessed with propriety, appearances, and gender roles rigid enough to snap if bent, the sight of a woman at the wheel of a motor car was nothing short of scandalous. Women were supposed to glide gracefully in carriages, not roar down country lanes in machines that looked and sounded like runaway boilers. Yet some elite Edwardian women did exactly that, embracing motoring with gusto. The result? Shocked gossip, endless editorials, and men gasping in horror as though they had just witnessed someone lighting a cigar during Sunday service. Seeing a woman behind the wheel made Edwardian men gasp louder than an unchaperoned ballroom dance. At first, the assumption was simple. Women could be passengers, not drivers. They were to sit in the back, wrapped in veils and dusters, while chauffeurs or husbands handled the greasy business of controlling the machine. Driving was considered too strenuous, too technical, and frankly too dangerous for delicate female constitutions. If a lady must participate, let her hold a parasol, not a steering wheel. But then came the rebels. Wealthy, independent-minded women quickly realised that motoring offered a freedom almost unheard of in their world. A car was not just a symbol of wealth, it was a symbol of independence. Behind the wheel, a woman could travel without waiting for an escort, decide her own pace, and most deliciously defy the expectations of everyone watching. For women hemmed in by etiquette and chaperones, the car was liberation on four wheels. Some of the most famous figures of the Edwardian era championed women's motoring. Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, leaders of the suffragette movement, used cars to great effect, driving between rallies and escaping angry mobs of opponents. Cars became political tools as much as personal luxuries, demonstrating that women could master modernity just as well as men. Driving was no longer just daring, it was defiance. High society ladies also made headlines. Wealthy heiresses and adventurous duchesses proudly took the wheel, thrilling to the rush of speed. Automobiles became fashionable accessories for independent women, much like Paris gowns or Paris lovers. Some women even joined early races, scandalizing onlookers who could not decide whether to be impressed or horrified. Imagine the scene: gentlemen in goggles and leather coats lined up for a race, only to find a determined duchess adjusting her veil and revving her engine beside them. Naturally, the backlash was fierce. Critics argued that women behind the wheel endangered everyone, including themselves. Doctors solemnly claimed that the vibrations of the car might damage a woman's nerves or, worse, her fertility. Clergymen warned that driving encouraged immodesty, since women had to wear practical clothing instead of elaborate gowns. Newspapers sneered that lady motorists were reckless, vain, or unfeminine. The veiled subtext was clear. The independence cars gave women was terrifying to those who preferred them safely confined to drawing rooms. But women refused to be intimidated. In fact, they turned motoring fashion into a weapon. Veils, goggles, and dusters gave female motorists an aura of mystery and daring. Far from diminishing femininity, motoring attire became chic, allowing women to cultivate a modern, adventurous look. Fashion magazines began to feature motoring outfits for women, complete with stylish hats designed not to blow off at 30 miles per hour. Soon, being a lady motorist wasn't just shocking, it was stylish. Motoring also reshaped social rituals. A woman offering a gentleman a seat in her car turned traditional courtship upside down. Instead of waiting for a suitor to provide transportation, she could whisk him away herself. This reversal of roles provoked knowing jokes in Edwardian society. Cartoonists lampooned the lady driver stereotype, often showing horrified men clinging to their seats while women laughed at the wheel. The joke, of course, masked a deeper anxiety. Women were seizing control, not just of cars but of social expectations. Practical concerns also played a part. Women drivers faced the same challenges as men: muddy roads, unreliable engines, punctured tyres, but with the added burden of skepticism from everyone around them. To be a woman driver was to be under constant scrutiny. A man stalling his car was unfortunate. A woman stalling her car was proof that women couldn't drive. Yet those who persevered carved out a new space in Edwardian society, one where competence mattered more than convention. Even royalty embraced the trend. Queen Alexandra was driven in cars early on, though she preferred chauffeurs. Meanwhile, younger aristocratic women were spotted confidently taking the wheel. Their presence sent a clear message: if cars were the future, women intended to be part of it. By the eve of World War I, female motorists were no longer mere curiosities. They were part of the motoring landscape. While still vastly outnumbered by men, they had established themselves as serious drivers, enthusiasts, and even icons of modern womanhood. The war would only accelerate this as women took on driving roles to support the military effort. But in the Edwardian years, every woman behind the wheel was already rewriting the rules. So when Edwardian society fretted about lady motorists, what they were really fretting about was change. Cars gave women independence, visibility, and speed, 3 things the old guard found unsettling. Yet that was precisely why women embraced them. For every shocked gasp on a country lane, there was a smile behind the veil of a woman who knew she was driving not just a car, but progress itself. Because in the Edwardian world, a woman at the wheel wasn't just steering an automobile, she was steering society toward the future, one scandalized gasp at a time. For centuries, the great estates of Britain had been defined by their stables. Horses were the pride of aristocratic life, glossy hunters for fox chases, elegant carriage teams for processions, and dependable nags for daily errands. Stables weren't just practical, they were architectural statements. A well-designed stable block showed wealth, taste, and tradition, but by the Edwardian era, something new began appearing beside them, the garage. And if horses had feelings, they probably weren't pleased. As one observer might have joked, "Your horses got jealous, but at least the car didn't leave surprises on the floor." The garage was more than a shed for a motor car. It was a symbol of change, a physical acknowledgement that the automobile was no passing fad. Aristocrats who once built entire wings for their stables now commissioned specialized outbuildings to house their cars. These weren't humble structures. Many were designed to harmonize with the grandeur of the estate. Brick or stone facades, sweeping arches, even ornamental details that made garages look more like chapels of modernity than storage units. Inside, the design reflected the new world of motoring. Instead of stalls filled with hay, there were bays with concrete or tiled floors, easy to clean after oil leaks and petrol spills. Instead of tack rooms for saddles and bridles, there were workrooms for tools, spare parts and shelves of motor spirit tins. Chauffeurs had their own quarters, often attached directly to the garage, complete with bunks, small kitchens, and the smell of grease embedded in every wall. The stable boy had evolved into the chauffeur, and the stable itself had evolved into the motor house. Some garages became miniature palaces for cars. Wealthy owners commissioned architects to design buildings with skylights, heating systems, and even decorative tile work. Cars, after all, were fragile and expensive. One couldn't just leave them out in the rain like a wheelbarrow. Owners fussed over their cars as they had once fussed over prized horses, ensuring they were polished, sheltered, and displayed properly when not in use. A gleaming Daimler or Napier looked far more impressive when framed by polished wood panels and brass fittings than when left to rust in a drafty shed. Of course, the presence of both stables and garages on the same estate created a curious kind of rivalry. Horses still had their uses, hunting, ceremonial parades, and tradition-bound displays, but the cars were stealing attention. Imagine the horses glaring jealously from their stalls as the new contraption purred into its bay, demanding petrol instead of oats. The sound of hooves and snorting was now joined by the clatter of engines and the hiss of steam. The estate yard, once perfumed with hay and manure, acquired a new aroma: oil, rubber, and petrol. For aristocrats, building a garage wasn't just about convenience, it was about prestige. A motor car cost as much as a small house, and to store it in a shabby shed would be like keeping diamonds in a biscuit tin. A proper garage announced to visitors, "We not only own cars, we house them in style." Guests arriving at country estates were often shown the motor house as proudly as the gardens or the ballroom. Tours of garages became fashionable, especially when the owner had multiple cars to show off. It was one thing to own a Renault, it was another to own 3 different models, each gleaming under skylights with a chauffeur polishing them like crown jewels. Some garages also doubled as status museums, decorated with motoring trophies, racing memorabilia, and photographs of daring drives. Visitors might admire a line of immaculate cars while sipping brandy, nodding approvingly at framed photos of the master of the house at the wheel, even if his chauffeur had done most of the actual driving. The garage became an extension of aristocratic identity, just as the stable once had been, a place to display, to impress, and to remind everyone that wealth was measured not only in acres, but in horsepower. Not everyone admired the change. Traditionalists grumbled that garages were vulgar intrusions on the pastoral beauty of estates. Some insisted that cars were noisy, smelly, and wholly unsuited to the countryside. They mourned the decline of the stable as the heart of aristocratic life, but the tide was against them. Each year brought more cars, more garages, and fewer excuses to rely solely on horses. For servants, the garage represented a new world of work. Stable hands had dealt with grooming, mucking out, and feeding. Garage staff dealt with oil changes, tyre patches, and polishing brass lamps. Both jobs were dirty, but in different ways. Some young men leapt at the chance to trade hay bales for spark plugs, seeing motoring as the future. Others longed for the simpler days when their worst fear was being kicked by a horse, not accidentally setting themselves on fire with petrol. By the eve of the First World War, the country house garage had become a fixture of aristocratic estates. It was a declaration that the owners belonged not only to the ancient world of landed wealth, but also to the modern world of machines. Horses and cars coexisted awkwardly, but the future was clear. The car bay would grow while the stable shrank. So the garage, that unglamorous but essential space, tells us a story as important as any ballroom or library. It shows how the Edwardians tried to reconcile tradition with modernity, how they made space literally for the future in the shadow of the past. And if the horses sulked about it, at least they could console themselves with one fact. While cars stole the spotlight, they never once tracked mud through the drawing room carpets. In Edwardian society, courtship was supposed to be an elegant ritual, carefully orchestrated dances, supervised strolls, and exchanges of glances across crowded ballrooms. Every detail was governed by etiquette, down to who fetched the lemonade and how long you could linger in the garden before raising eyebrows. But then along came the motor car, and suddenly romance wasn't confined to candlelit drawing rooms. It had wheels, an engine, and a top speed that could leave chaperones coughing in the dust. For wealthy young men looking to impress, cars became the ultimate wingman. After all, nothing said romance like shouting sweet nothings over the sound of an engine misfiring. The appeal was obvious. To invite a young lady for a drive was to offer her an entirely new experience. Gone were the rigidly scripted walks through manicured gardens, replaced by adventures down country lanes at exhilarating speeds. The car created opportunities for privacy, excitement, and a dash of danger, all the ingredients for Edwardian flirtation. A drive in a motor car was not just transportation, it was an event, and one that could make a suitor stand out from the sea of eligible bachelors in starched collars. The element of privacy was especially intoxicating. In a carriage, a young couple was usually accompanied by a coachman or footman perched just a few feet away. In a drawing room, watchful mothers and aunts kept eagle eyes on every move. But in a motor car, even with a chauffeur at the wheel, the back seat provided a space where conversation could flow more freely, voices muffled by the roar of the engine and the rush of wind. And if the gentleman dared to drive himself, the intimacy was heightened. Just two people, alone with the hum of machinery and the uncertainty of whether the vehicle would actually reach its destination. Cars also provided a stage for showing off. A gleaming Renault or Daimler, polished to a shine, announced a suitor's wealth more effectively than a diamond tie pin. Offering a lady a ride in such a machine was like saying, "Not only am I wealthy, but I am modern, daring, and willing to risk both of our lives for the sake of romance." The car's very impracticality made it impressive. Few things could flatter a potential partner more than the knowledge that their suitor was willing to spend a fortune on a toy just to win their admiration. Of course, driving skills or lack thereof could make or break an impression. A gentleman who handled the wheel with steady confidence could look like a heroic pioneer. A gentleman who stalled repeatedly, crashed into hedges, or set his engine smoking could look more like a clown. The line between dashing adventurer and hapless buffoon was alarmingly thin. Some young men, aware of their own incompetence, wisely relied on chauffeurs to maintain dignity. Others barreled ahead, figuring that a near-death experience might at least be memorable. For women, the ride itself could be thrilling. Many Edwardian ladies had been raised in environments where their movements were tightly controlled. Suddenly, here was a machine that offered speed, fresh air, and a sense of escape. A drive at 20 miles per hour might leave hair tangled and veils askew, but it also left cheeks flushed with excitement. It was a taste of freedom, and freedom was intoxicating. Society, predictably, was divided on the propriety of this new form of courtship. Moralists fretted about the perils of motoring, not just physical but moral. The idea of young couples vanishing down country lanes unsupervised caused many a parent sleepless nights. Clergymen warned that cars encouraged recklessness, while etiquette manuals struggled to catch up. Was it proper for a lady to accept a drive? Should she always bring a chaperone? How long could the trip last before it became scandalous? The lack of clear rules only added to the allure. Cartoonists, never ones to miss an opportunity, had a field day. Satirical sketches showed love-struck young men shouting over engines while ladies clung to their veils, half in terror and half in delight. Others mocked the overconfidence of male drivers, who treated the wheel like a weapon of seduction, even as their passengers prayed for survival. The subtext was clear. The motor car had turned romance into a noisy, unpredictable adventure. Cars also reshaped rituals of engagement. In the past, proposing during a walk in the garden was the height of romance. By the Edwardian era, there were whispered tales of proposals made in the back seat of cars, the words nearly drowned out by the rattle of the engine. The symbolism was obvious. Love was no longer bound by old traditions. It was moving forward, powered by petrol. And for the most adventurous couples, the car itself became part of their story. Shared memories of near misses, breakdowns, or impromptu picnics by the roadside could bond a couple more effectively than 100 ballroom dances. Courtship was no longer just about polite conversation. It was about shared experience, adrenaline, and sometimes the shared relief of surviving a terrifying journey together. So when we think of Edwardian motoring, we shouldn't just picture dukes and duchesses roaring off to society events. We should also picture blushing debutantes, nervous bachelors, and the awkward yet thrilling moments when cars became Cupid's unlikely accomplices. Because in the Edwardian era, romance wasn't whispered under chandeliers, it was shouted over the clatter of engines and the squeal of tyres, with love letters written in dust across the countryside. For centuries, the English countryside had been a place of retreat for the aristocracy. Before cars, the wealthy explored it in carriages, on horseback, or through leisurely walks across rolling estates. But the motor car added a new dimension. The countryside became a playground for speed, spectacle, and leisure tours. Suddenly, dukes and duchesses weren't just surveying their land, they were roaring through villages, scattering chickens and turning quiet lanes into noisy demonstrations of modernity. Or, as one might put it, you could terrify sheep, shock villagers, and arrive at tea 10 minutes early, a true miracle. Leisure touring quickly became one of the most fashionable uses of the motor car. For Edwardian elites, the idea wasn't to get anywhere in particular, it was to be seen going somewhere in particular. Cars transformed a simple trip into an event. A drive through the countryside allowed one to display not only one's wealth, but also one's adventurous spirit. After all, anyone could host a tea party in a country house. It took something more daring to show up at a friend's estate via a machine that looked and sounded like an angry dragon. The countryside was, of course, not designed for cars. Narrow lanes, hedgerows, and cobblestone village streets made each outing unpredictable. But unpredictability was half the fun. A country drive offered surprises. Flocks of geese blocking the way, wagons stuck in ruts, or startled villagers leaping aside as a gleaming Daimler rattled past. To the driver and passengers, these inconveniences were part of the charm. Each obstacle was another story to retell later over champagne. Villagers, however, were less charmed. To them, a touring car wasn't a glamorous novelty, it was an intrusion. The noise frightened livestock. The smell of petrol lingered unpleasantly, and the clouds of dust coated hedges, windowsills, and freshly laundered linens. Letters to newspapers complained bitterly about aristocrats treating rural lanes as racetracks. Farmers, already suspicious of city folk, now had to contend with machines that could flatten their hens and ruin a hay cart in seconds. For rural communities, the Edwardian touring craze was often less a marvel of progress than a nuisance. But for the elite, those complaints barely registered. The countryside wasn't just scenery, it was theatre. Driving through picturesque landscapes gave passengers a chance to enjoy the view, all while feeling superior to those still trudging along on foot. Some routes became particularly fashionable, winding drives through Surrey, scenic jaunts along the Thames Valley, or daring trips into the wilder hills of Wales. Guidebooks for motorists began appearing, filled with recommended touring routes, charming villages to stop at, and reminders to pack extra petrol cans in case of emergencies. The car also transformed weekend excursions. Instead of lengthy train rides or horse-drawn journeys, aristocrats could now visit neighbouring estates or beauty spots with relative ease. A 2-day trip became a 1-day adventure. Suddenly, destinations that had once felt remote were accessible. turning the countryside into an extended playground. For the wealthy, this expanded mobility wasn't just practical, it was intoxicating. Freedom now came with 4 wheels and a chauffeur in goggles. Touring also encouraged a new form of social ritual, the motoring picnic. Instead of dining indoors, fashionable Edwardians packed hampers of champagne, cold meats and strawberries and set off into the countryside. They'd stop in a field, spread rugs and eat surrounded by startled cows, while chauffeurs hovered discreetly nearby. The contrast between rustic settings and aristocratic luxury only heightened the spectacle. Imagine fur-clad ladies nibbling sandwiches while their damlers and napiers gleamed in the background like mechanical ornaments. For women, country touring provided an unusual degree of freedom. Even if they weren't behind the wheel, they could enjoy the thrill of speed and the novelty of landscapes usually reserved for hunting parties. Motoring allowed them to experience the countryside directly, veils whipping in the wind, far from the stuffy interiors of drawing rooms. For men, touring was a chance to play the hero, navigating rough roads, managing unexpected breakdowns, and gallantly ensuring their passengers survived both dust and excitement. Not all tours went smoothly, of course. Cars broke down constantly, leaving aristocrats stranded in villages where locals regarded them with a mix of suspicion and amusement. Stories abound of chauffeurs frantically tinkering with engines while their employers sat on rugs, sipping tea as if nothing were amiss. In some cases, villagers pitched in, helping to push cars out of ruts or offering barns as makeshift garages. These encounters were awkward cultural collisions, the elite arriving in noisy symbols of modernity, only to rely on rural goodwill when the machines failed them. Touring also had its dangers. Speeding along narrow lanes with no warning signs often led to collisions, not just with ditches and hedges, but occasionally with entire farm carts. Yet these mishaps only added to the adventure. Returning from a countryside tour covered in dust, hair dishevelled and car dented was almost a badge of honour, a reminder that one had dared to embrace the thrilling, if unpredictable joys of motoring. By the late Edwardian period, countryside touring had become almost ritualised. Car clubs organised group outings, with convoys of cars parading through villages like mobile fashion shows. Locals lined the roads, half to admire the spectacle and half to mutter curses under their breath. For the participants, the drives were less about the destination and more about the performance of leisure. So while sheep may have panicked and villagers despaired, the Edwardian elite revelled in their countryside adventures. Touring turned rural England into a stage for wealth, daring and display. It was noisy, inconvenient, and often infuriating to everyone else, but for those in the back seats of gleaming motor cars, it was pure exhilaration, because nothing made you feel more alive in Edwardian Britain than frightening livestock rattling down a country lane and arriving just in time for tea with a story worth retelling. If the countryside offered Edwardian motorists fresh air, picnics and the occasional startled cow, the city offered something else entirely: chaos. Nowhere was this more evident than in London, where the motorcar collided, sometimes literally, with centuries of urban life built around horses, carts and foot traffic. The result was a cacophony of noise, dust and frustration that gave birth to a new British tradition. It was the birth of the traffic jam, which has remained Britain's most reliable tradition. London at the dawn of motoring was already one of the busiest cities in the world. Its streets groaned under the weight of hansom cabs, omnibuses, delivery wagons, bicycles, and throngs of pedestrians. Into this maelstrom came the motor car, snorting and rattling like a mechanical interloper. It wasn't just faster than other vehicles, it was louder, smellier, and infinitely more alarming to horses. Every journey through the city became a battle of wills, the motorist determined to make progress, and everyone else determined not to be killed. The first challenge was sheer congestion. Roads in central London were narrow, winding, and perpetually clogged. Motorcars might boast top speeds of 30 mph on open roads, but in the city they crawled at walking pace, hemmed in by carriages and pedestrians. Chauffeurs sat fuming at the wheel while their passengers, wealthy aristocrats who had expected a triumphal procession, sank into their seats, realising they could have walked to their destination faster. Edwardian London thus became the birthplace of an ironic truth. The faster the car, the slower the journey. Noise compounded the problem. Motor horns were supposed to warn pedestrians, but in practice they became instruments of constant irritation. Drivers leaned on their bulb horns with abandon, creating a chorus of honks that echoed through the streets. Pedestrians leapt, horses reared, and other drivers honked back in an endless cycle of acoustic warfare. Satirical newspapers joked that London's new soundtrack was brass band meets battlefield, with the only missing element being actual cannon fire. Pedestrians, for their part, were outraged, accustomed to stepping into roads with little more concern than dodging the occasional carriage. They now faced lethal machines that did not stop on a whim. Laws required motorists to drive carefully, but carefully was a vague concept when half the city seemed determined to cross streets at random intervals. Magistrates heard endless cases of pedestrians knocked down, frightened or splattered with mud. Each incident fueled the growing perception that motorists were arrogant menaces, rich playboys treating public streets as their personal playgrounds. Then there were the horses. London's traffic was still dominated by them, and they did not adapt gracefully. Motor cars terrified them. A horse that had calmly endured years of cabs and buses might bolt at the sight or worse the sound of an automobile. Chaos often ensued. Wagons overturned, carriages careened into crowds, and constables found themselves sprinting after panicked animals. Motorists were blamed, of course, and yet the cars kept coming. The city was locked in a messy transition, half horse, half machine, and wholly inconvenient. Parking presented another absurd challenge. Country houses had garages. London had no such infrastructure. Cars were left at curbsides, outside hotels, or in hastily adapted carriage yards. Wealthy owners often instructed their chauffeurs to simply circle the block until summoned, turning the city into a carousel of idling engines and exhausted drivers. If you thought modern parking in London was bad, imagine Edwardian chauffeurs endlessly looping Piccadilly, dodging carts and constables, all for the sake of waiting on lady this or that to finish her shopping. Accidents were inevitable. Reports of collisions filled newspapers, cars running into trams, skidding into lampposts or flattening hapless cyclists. Each mishap sparked outrage. Letters poured into editors' offices demanding stricter regulations, lower speed limits or outright bans. Cartoonists gleefully exaggerated the chaos, drawing cars mowing down entire lines of pedestrians, or aristocrats peering cluelessly from the back seat, while their chauffeur wrestled the wheel. Londoners, long accustomed to grumbling about traffic, now had a new villain to curse: the motorist. Yet, paradoxically, the chaos only added to the car's glamour. To be stuck in traffic was irritating, but to be stuck in traffic in a motor car was a mark of status. It meant you belonged to the elite few who could afford this modern inconvenience. The clatter, honking and fumes became part of the city's theatre, with cars as the stars of a noisy, frustrating and strangely captivating show. The motoring clubs leaned into this perception, organising parades through London streets. These processions, ostensibly meant to showcase progress, usually devolved into bottlenecks that amused pedestrians as much as they impressed them. Watching a line of expensive cars inch along the Strand at a snail's pace while chauffeurs sweated in their coats was less a demonstration of power than of absurdity. Still, society turned out to watch, proving that even when cars failed to move, they succeeded in drawing attention. As the years passed, London adapted. New rules, more police presence, and eventually new roads began to ease the chaos. But in the Edwardian years, city driving remained a maddening, hazardous ordeal. Motorists who had dreamed of modern freedom discovered instead the modern curse, sitting motionless in a line of traffic, wondering whether progress was all it was cracked up to be. So while the countryside offered exhilaration, London offered exasperation. Yet both experiences were essential to the Edwardian motor craze. The city showcased the flaws as vividly as the countryside showcased the thrills. Together, they made motoring not just a pastime, but a defining feature of modern life, equal parts elegance, comedy and chaos, because in the end, Edwardian London proved a simple truth: progress may give you engines, but it also gives you gridlock. And that tradition has never gone away. The Edwardian motor car wasn't just a machine, it was a class system on wheels. To own one marked you as part of the elite, as surely as a title or a country estate. For everyone else, cars were noisy, expensive nuisances that roared past at alarming speeds and left behind a trail of dust, mud and fumes. If you couldn't afford one, you still got to share the experience by inhaling their exhaust. In the early 1900s, the cost of a motor car was astronomical. Even a modest model could cost more than an average worker earned in years, and running it required a steady flow of petrol, repairs, chauffeurs and garages. That put ownership firmly out of reach for all but the ultra-wealthy. Cars became instant class markers, more conspicuous than jewelry or clothing. You could fake an expensive hat, but you couldn't fake a Daimler. For the wealthy, this exclusivity was part of the appeal. The car was a moving declaration of privilege, a way to distinguish themselves from the masses. A drive through town wasn't just a journey, it was a parade of wealth. Aristocrats and industrialists lounged in the back seats while chauffeurs guided their gleaming machines through streets filled with working-class pedestrians and horse-drawn carts. The message was unmistakable. We are modern. You are not. For everyone else, cars were both fascinating and infuriating. On the one hand, people crowded roadsides to watch them pass, marveling at their speed and gleaming brass fittings. Children ran alongside, pointing and laughing, while villagers gossiped about the eccentricities of local aristocrats who dared to ride such contraptions. On the other hand, the noise, smell, and danger bred resentment. Motorists seemed to treat roads as their personal playgrounds, scattering chickens and splattering pedestrians without a second thought. Working families who had never ridden in a car nonetheless felt its impact, often quite literally, when mud sprayed across their clothes on the way to church. This resentment was sharpened by the stark divide in experience. The elite enjoyed motoring as a leisure activity, touring the countryside, attending races, or flaunting cars outside clubs, while the working classes endured it as a hazard. A farmer's cart jolted into a ditch by a speeding motorist was not a glamorous adventure, it was a ruined day's labour. For the farmer, the motor car was less a symbol of progress than a reminder that wealth gave some people the freedom to endanger others without consequence. Newspapers amplified this divide. Reports of aristocrats fined for furious driving became a regular feature, often with a wink of admiration for their daring. But for readers, it also highlighted the double standard. The wealthy could afford fines. The poor could not. To a labourer trudging home from the factory, the sight of a lord roaring past in a car was a bitter symbol of inequality. Cars didn't just widen the gap between classes, they put it on public display. Even within the upper classes, cars became tools of social stratification. The type of car you owned mattered. A modest runabout suggested comfortable wealth. A custom-built Daimler or Rolls-Royce screamed aristocracy. Some families collected multiple cars, one for town and another for country, turning motoring into yet another arena for competitive display. Guests arriving at country houses were judged not only on their attire, but on the car they arrived in. If stables had once been a way to measure a family's prestige, garages now served the same purpose. Meanwhile, the middle classes stood awkwardly in the middle of this divide. Professionals and merchants aspired to join the motoring elite, but the cost remained prohibitive. Some managed to buy second-hand or foreign imports, but these often broke down, reinforcing stereotypes that only the truly wealthy could afford reliable cars. Others embraced bicycles or motorcycles, cheaper and more practical, but socially inferior. To ride a motorbike was daring. To ride in a car was distinguished. For the working classes, cars remained distant objects of envy or contempt. Some rural villagers saw them as alien machines, intruding on traditional life. Cartoons of the time lampooned the motorist as a pompous aristocrat, monocle firmly in place leaving chaos in his wake. Satirical sketches captured the bitterness of those left choking in clouds of dust, while the wealthy sped on to garden parties. Cars didn't just symbolize progress, they symbolized privilege, and yet fascination never disappeared. Even those who despised cars couldn't resist staring at them. A gleaming motor car parked outside a hotel drew as much attention as royalty. Children dreamed of riding in one someday, while mechanics and tinkerers dreamed of building their own. For all their divisiveness, cars ignited curiosity, setting the stage for their eventual spread across society. Still, in the Edwardian years, the divide was sharp. Cars weren't democratizing technology. They were elite toys. They separated the haves of the have-nots more visibly than almost anything else. Roads that had once been communal spaces, shared by pedestrians, horses and carts, became stages where the wealthy paraded their modernity, while others stood aside, coughing in the dust. The irony, of course, is that this exclusivity made cars more desirable. By flaunting their privilege, the Edwardian elite inadvertently guaranteed that others would eventually want cars too. What began as a divisive symbol of inequality would within decades become the very hallmark of middle-class respectability. But in the Edwardian moment, the divide was absolute, because in that era, cars didn't just carry people, they carried class, and if you weren't inside one, you were on the outside, squinting through a cloud of exhaust and muttering about progress. If the Edwardian motor car was a symbol of wealth, nothing legitimized it faster than seeing kings, princes and celebrities perched inside one. In a society obsessed with hierarchy and imitation, the endorsement of the famous turned cars from eccentric contraptions into cultural icons. After all, when an aristocrat bought a car, it was indulgence, but when the king drove a car, it wasn't rebellion, it was fashion with horsepower. Edward VII, who reigned from 1901 to 1910, was at the heart of this transformation. Known for his appetite for luxury and modern comforts, he was precisely the sort of monarch cars needed. Edward loved spectacle and society, and the motor car offered both. He was one of the first monarchs to openly embrace motoring, taking to the wheel himself at times, though chauffeurs were usually at hand for practical purposes. When newspapers published photographs of the king beside a gleaming Daimler, it signalled more than just royal preference. It told the public that cars were no longer experimental toys. They were fashionable, regal, and worth aspiring to. His enthusiasm had ripple effects across high society. Aristocrats, eager to stay in royal favour, hurried to purchase their own machines. Carriages might still have their place, but suddenly a Daimler or Napier was the ticket to modernity. Edward VII even influenced official practices. Motor cars began to appear in royal processions, altering traditions that had been horse-drawn for centuries. For a monarch who adored public display, the car was not only convenient, it was theatrical. Beyond the king, other royals and aristocrats joined the craze. The Prince of Wales, later George V, was more reserved in his tastes, but even he recognised the utility of motoring. European royals too embraced the fad. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was a noted enthusiast, often photographed with his fleet of German cars, a subtle advertisement for his nation's engineering prowess. Across the Channel, French elites displayed similar zeal, eager to prove that Parisian style extended to automobiles as much as fashion. But it wasn't only royals. The Edwardian era's new celebrity culture gave cars a wider spotlight. Stage actors, opera singers and sports figures all discovered the publicity power of being photographed in a motor car. Newspapers that once featured society weddings and political speeches now included spreads of celebrities posing with their gleaming machines. Owning a car became shorthand for modern sophistication, a way to burnish one's reputation as someone at the forefront of change. One of the most striking aspects of celebrity motoring was its role in bridging the gap between tradition and novelty. Many Edwardians were sceptical of cars, too noisy, too dangerous, too foreign, but when beloved public figures appeared in them, doubt softened. If the king, the Kaiser, or a favourite actress could embrace the machine, perhaps it wasn't so dreadful after all. Motoring thus became not just a pastime for the wealthy, but a cultural performance where celebrity endorsement reassured the public that this noisy contraption was the future. The press eagerly amplified this trend. Illustrated magazines delighted in showing famous figures behind the wheel, their faces framed by goggles and dusters. The juxtaposition was irresistible. Men and women who had once seemed untouchable, now caught mid-laugh in open cars, wind tugging at veils and moustaches. For Edwardians, these images conveyed a new kind of intimacy with the famous. The motor car, ironically, made celebrities more relatable, even as it underscored their exclusivity. Edward VII's love for cars also helped soften some of the social tension surrounding motoring. Critics complained about reckless aristocrats splashing mud and endangering villagers, but it was harder to sneer when the monarch himself was a devotee. If the king could embrace modernity, then surely motoring wasn't merely the frivolous indulgence of spoiled elites. It was progress, sanctioned by the crown. The king's endorsement gave cars legitimacy in ways no lobbying group or motor club ever could. Of course, celebrity motoring also had its comedic moments. Stories circulated of titled figures breaking down in inconvenient places, forced to accept help from bewildered peasants who barely knew what a motor car was. One can imagine the absurdity, a duke explaining to a farmer that his spark plug had failed, while the farmer wondered if that was some exotic breed of horse. These incidents made for irresistible anecdotes in the press, reinforcing both the glamour and the absurdity of celebrity life. The symbolic power of these celebrity motorists extended well beyond the Edwardian period. By associating cars with royalty and fame, They ensured that motoring would never be dismissed as a passing fad. Cars became aspirational, woven into the fabric of status and desire. Ordinary people might not afford one yet, but they could dream of it, imagine it, and admire it from afar. In this sense, the celebrity embrace of cars transformed them from machines into cultural icons. They weren't just for getting from point A to point B, they were for being seen between point A and point B. And when Edward VII leaned back in his motor car, cigar in hand, he embodied the new Edwardian creed. Progress was not about necessity, but about display. So the next time someone claims celebrity endorsements are a modern invention, remember the Edwardians? Long before influencers posted selfies with sports cars, kings and stage stars were doing the same, albeit in goggles, veils, and clouds of exhaust. Because in Edwardian Britain, if the king drove a car, you weren't just witnessing royalty, you were witnessing the future, complete with horsepower and a dash of cigar smoke. Technology has a way of sneaking into culture long before it becomes ordinary, and the Edwardian motor car was no exception. Painters, novelists, playwrights, and even poets found themselves grappling with this noisy newcomer. Horses had centuries of mythology behind them, sleek steeds of knights, pastoral images of country life. But the motor car, it was loud, smelly, unreliable, and modern. Yet it fascinated artists and writers who couldn't resist weaving it into their work. Poets wrote about love, nature, and now occasionally punctured tyres. Edwardian fiction was quick to latch onto the car as a symbol. For some novelists, it represented thrilling modernity, the promise of speed, escape, and adventure. For others, it was a symbol of disruption, intruding into quiet villages and upending traditional ways of life. Cars could sweep lovers away on daring journeys, or they could crush chickens under their wheels and scandalize pedestrians. The ambiguity made them irresistible as plot devices. Take E. M. Forster's Howard's End, 1910, one of the most celebrated Edwardian novels. The car appears as a recurring motif, representing wealth, intrusion, and the unstoppable march of change. Characters use cars to traverse the social and geographic landscape of England, but the journeys are rarely smooth. Engines fail, journeys are delayed, and accidents highlight the fragility of modern life. The motor car becomes a metaphor, not just for progress, but for its perils. Other writers took a lighter view. P.G. Wodehouse, who would later define the comic novel, began sprinkling his early Edwardian stories with references to cars as playthings of the idle rich. Aristocrats bungled drives, flirted in back seats, and treated breakdowns as opportunities for comedy rather than crisis. Cars, in this literary world, were less about progress than about farce. Machines that turned the absurdities of high society into even bigger spectacles. The stage also embraced the motor car. Playwrights found endless comic material in breakdowns, misfires, and motoring mix-ups. Imagine the scene. A young couple plans a romantic outing, only for their car to explode in smoke as the curtain falls. The absurdity of combining delicate Edwardian fashion with oily engines and petrol fumes made for natural comedy. Audiences roared with laughter, partly because they recognized the truth. Cars really were that unreliable. Art, too, reflected the obsession. Traditional portrait painters were soon asked to include motor cars in commissions. Instead of simply posing beside a hunting dog or a fine horse, aristocrats now wanted to be immortalized with their gleaming machines. A portrait of a gentleman in a duster coat, leaning proudly against his Daimler, sent a message louder than words. This was a man not just of lineage, but of modernity. Painters adapted, though one imagines many silently cursed the challenge of rendering brass fittings and rubber tyres instead of well-behaved horses. Meanwhile, illustrators and cartoonists had a field day. Satirical magazines like Punch churned out endless jokes at the expense of motorists. Cartoon depictions of cars barreling through hedges, scattering pedestrians, or carrying pompous aristocrats were staples of the Edwardian press. These exaggerated images reflected both fascination and resentment. To laugh at cars was also to acknowledge their growing presence, and to vent frustration at the way they disrupted everyday life. Even poetry, that most traditional of forms, wasn't immune. While poets didn't abandon roses and sonnets, a few daring writers began slipping in references to speed and modernity. Futurism, the avant-garde movement that celebrated machines, speed and power, gained momentum on the continent. Italian futurists rhapsodized about cars as mechanical gods, their verses vibrating with the energy of engines. While Edwardian Britain was more restrained, echoes of this fascination crept into its artistic circles. For a culture rooted in the pastoral, the intrusion of petrol and pistons was jarring, but also irresistible. Cultural critics noticed too. Essays in journals debated whether motoring represented decadence or progress. Some praised it as the emblem of a bold new age, while others lamented its destruction of peace and quiet. The very fact that art and literature debated cars showed their significance. The motor car wasn't just a machine, it was a cultural question mark, asking what kind of society Edwardians wanted to become. The car even shaped leisure reading. Motoring magazines filled with technical articles and glamorous photographs doubled as cultural artifacts. They weren't just manuals, they were aspirational literature, filled with images of men and women embracing modernity. In their pages, the car became a stage for fashion, romance and adventure, blending practical instruction with cultural myth-making. And of course, the humour never stopped. Stories of motorists breaking down at inconvenient moments became stock material for both literature and theatre. Poets might elevate the motor car into a symbol of progress, but playwrights knew the audience would laugh harder at a misfiring engine than at a lofty metaphor. The cultural presence of cars was thus both serious and ridiculous, mirroring their real-world existence. By the eve of World War I, the car had firmly embedded itself in Edwardian culture. It was in novels, plays, cartoons, paintings and essays. It inspired awe, ridicule, romance and satire, and just like on the roads, it divided opinion sharply. Some saw it as the future, others saw it as a noisy intrusion, but no one could ignore it. So while poets still wrote about sunsets and roses, and painters still depicted pastoral estates, there was a new muse in town. The motor car, with its rattles, fumes and undeniable allure, had driven its way into the cultural imagination. Because in Edwardian Britain, even art discovered the truth. Nothing captures the human condition quite like love, nature and a flat tire. If Edwardian cars looked glamorous gliding past country houses or parading through London, that was because no one painted the hours they spent broken down in hedgerows. Behind every gleaming Daimler or Napier was a truth every owner knew. Cars failed, constantly. They sputtered, they wheezed, they punctured, they leaked, and sometimes they simply refused to move at all. For Edwardian motorists, owning a car wasn't about driving. It was about waiting by the roadside while your chauffeur swore at it. The technology of the time was still astonishingly temperamental. Engines overheated after short journeys, radiators boiled over, and belts snapped at the worst possible moments. Carburetors were notoriously fickle, sometimes flooding, sometimes starving the engine, often leaving the chauffeur muttering darkly as aristocrats fanned themselves in the back seat. Electrical systems were equally unreliable, with early magnetos and batteries prone to sudden failure. If an Edwardian motorist made it through an entire trip without incident, it was considered less a success and more a miracle. Tyre punctures were the bane of every motorist's existence. Early rubber simply couldn't handle rough roads, potholes and sharp stones. A single trip across the countryside might result in multiple blowouts. Chauffeurs carried spare tyres, pumps and repair kits as standard equipment, and roadside tyre changes became a familiar ritual. The wealthy joked that they could recite the process of patching a tube better than they could recite poetry. Less wealthy drivers learned to dread the sound of a sudden hiss, an audible reminder that their day had just gotten longer, dirtier, and more expensive. Breakdowns weren't just inconvenient, they were humiliating. A motor car was supposed to symbolize wealth and modernity, but nothing shattered that illusion faster than watching the proud machine grind to a halt in front of jeering villagers. Farmers led their horses past, smirking as the modern marvel sat motionless. Children laughed and offered helpful commentary like, "It doesn't go." For elites accustomed to deference, this was agony. Some took to staging elaborate displays of patience, calmly sipping tea from a hamper while their chauffeur crawled under the car, cursing bolts that refused to turn. Chauffeurs, of course, bore the brunt of these nightmares. They were expected to be drivers, mechanics and miracle workers rolled into one. A competent chauffeur carried not just wrenches but an arsenal of spare parts. Spark plugs, fuses, lengths of wire, even replacement lamps. Entire journeys were punctuated with unscheduled stops as chauffeurs tinkered, adjusted, and occasionally invented solutions on the fly. For their employers, motoring was leisure. For chauffeurs, it was combat against engines that refused to cooperate and employers who demanded punctuality anyway. The unreliability also dictated how journeys were planned. Wealthy families never set off without spare petrol cans, toolkits and blankets in case the car stranded them for hours. Trips were padded with generous margins of time, since 4 hours to Bath often meant 4 hours of driving and 2 hours of repairs. Motoring guides even included advice on where to find blacksmiths, cycle shops or chemists who could supply emergency parts. Driving wasn't just an outing, it was an endurance test. Some failures bordered on the absurd. Lamps went out in the middle of night journeys, leaving cars plunging into darkness. Radiators cracked in cold weather, spewing steam like angry kettles. Axles snapped, stranding motorists miles from help. Stories circulated of aristocrats hitching their cars to horses to drag them home, a scene that must have wounded the pride of both species. The irony was never lost. The horse, supposedly made obsolete by the motor car, remained the only reliable backup. Nor did prestige models guarantee reliability. A Rolls-Royce might be finely engineered, but it was still vulnerable to punctures and mechanical tantrums. Daimlers and Renaults might look stately, but they sulked like divas when conditions weren't perfect. Owners discovered that buying the most expensive car didn't free them from breakdowns. It just meant their breakdowns were more widely reported and more embarrassing. For many Edwardians, these mechanical nightmares became part of the motoring culture. Jokes about endless repairs filled newspapers and cartoons. Motoring clubs shared tips on how to fix common failures, and some even hosted demonstrations of roadside repair techniques. To be a motorist was to join a fraternity of sufferers bound together by shared experiences of frustration and grease. Complaining about breakdowns became as much a part of motoring as enjoying the rare moments of uninterrupted travel. And yet, perversely, the inconvenience added to the car's mystique. Driving wasn't easy, and that was the point. To own a motor car was to prove you had the wealth, patience, and staff to endure its quirks. Each successful journey, no matter how punctuated by delays, was a small triumph over adversity. Telling stories of roadside mishaps became a form of social currency. "We only had 3 punctures on the way to Brighton," was recounted with the same pride as "we shot 6 pheasants before lunch." By the eve of the First World War, improvements in engineering were slowly reducing the rate of breakdowns. Better tyres, stronger engines, and standardized parts were emerging, but in the Edwardian heyday, cars were still unreliable, and everyone knew it. That unreliability was part of their character, part of what made them both infuriating and unforgettable. So if we picture Edwardian cars as sleek status symbols gliding effortlessly along roads, we miss the reality. They were just as often stopped dead, tilted into hedges, or surrounded by aristocrats sipping tea while a chauffeur swore in 3 languages. Because in truth, Edwardian motoring wasn't about the joy of the open road. It was about learning how much dignity one could maintain while waiting beside a broken machine. For centuries, horses had been the backbone of British transport. They pulled cabs, carriages, wagons, omnibuses and ploughs. Entire trades existed to breed, train and care for them. They were elegant in sport, practical in labour, and utterly embedded in culture. Then the motor car arrived, and the result was an uneasy coexistence that often looked more like a battlefield. If your car didn't frighten 3 horses and 1 milkmaid a day, were you even driving? The clash began with noise. Horses, accustomed to the steady clatter of hooves and wheels, did not react kindly to backfiring engines and honking horns. Early motorists reported countless encounters with panicked animals bolting at the sight or sound of a car. Carriages tipped, wagons overturned, and pedestrians scattered as startled horses tried to escape the mechanical monsters. Farmers cursed motorists for endangering their livelihood, while constables sighed as yet another argument broke out between aristocrats in cars and tradesmen with runaway horses. It wasn't just fear, it was insult. For centuries, horses had been symbols of wealth and prestige. To own fine thoroughbreds or a perfectly matched carriage team was the mark of a gentleman. Suddenly, a machine threatened to make that investment look obsolete. Aristocrats who had proudly displayed their stables now watched with unease as their neighbours built garages. Horsemen sneered at motorists, calling cars unreliable and vulgar, while motorists retorted that horses left messes on the road and required far more maintenance than any car. Both sides were right, and both were determined to prove it. In cities, the conflict played out daily. London's streets were still dominated by horse-drawn cabs and omnibuses, and drivers resented cars muscling into their territory. Taxi drivers muttered about reckless aristocrats endangering decent folk, while motorists complained about lumbering carriages clogging the roads. The two modes of transport jostled for dominance, with pedestrians caught in the middle. It was like a live-action metaphor for the clash between old and new, hoof against wheel, tradition against innovation. The manure question loomed large in this cultural war. Horses, while beloved, left behind mountains of waste. By the late 19th century, London was drowning in horse manure, thousands of tons per week carted away by exhausted workers. Motorists gleefully pointed this out, claiming their cars were cleaner, more modern alternatives. But opponents countered that cars replaced manure with dust, fumes and danger, which was worse, stepping in something unpleasant, or being flattened by a Daimler. Edwardians weren't entirely sure. On country roads, the battles were even more dramatic. Farmers driving horse-drawn carts often found their animals spooked by approaching cars. Some motorists tried slowing down to ease the encounter. Others saw no reason to accommodate old-fashioned traffic. Skirmishes broke out, sometimes literally. Accounts survive of angry farmers waving whips at motorists or of chauffeurs shouting insults as they sped away. The countryside, once defined by pastoral calm, became an arena where ancient horse culture collided with modern machines. This tension even crept into law. Early motoring regulations often prioritized horse safety. Motorists were expected to stop and let horses pass if they showed signs of distress. Courts sometimes ruled in favor of horse drivers in disputes, treating cars as intruders on established rights of way. These laws reflected a society still uncertain whether cars were legitimate road users or unwelcome novelties. For horsemen, the message was reassuring. Tradition still mattered. For motorists, it was infuriating. The rivalry wasn't entirely hostile, however. Some wealthy families kept both. Horses were still essential for fox hunting, ceremonial parades and leisurely rides, while cars offered speed and modern glamour. On grand estates, stables and garages sat uneasily side by side, the whinny of horses mingling with the cough of engines. Yet even here the writing was on the wall. Each year, garages grew larger, while stables quietly shrank. Satirists delighted in the conflict. Cartoons in magazines showed horses glaring suspiciously at cars, or aristocrats caught between the loyalty of their steeds and the allure of modern machines. Some joked that cars were just horseless carriages, temporary fads that would never replace the real thing. Others quipped that if progress meant frightening half the livestock in Surrey, perhaps progress could wait. Yet beneath the humour lay real cultural anxiety. Horses were more than transport. They were tied to identity, tradition and class. A gentleman who rode well was admired. A gentleman who drove well was still in some circles a curiosity. Riding was skillful and noble. Motoring was noisy and mechanical. To older generations, this shift felt like the erosion of values they held dear, but the inevitability of change was clear. By the end of the Edwardian era, cars were multiplying, while horses were retreating from the city. What had once been a war became a slow surrender. Horses would remain in sport and ceremony, but on the roads their dominance was broken. Motorists had won, not by being loved, but by being unstoppable. So the war on horses was both literal and symbolic. It was the daily battle of frightened animals and angry farmers, but also the deeper struggle of tradition yielding to modernity. And though the horses may have snorted and stamped their hooves in defiance, their days as rulers of the road were numbered, because in Edwardian Britain, every honk of a motor horn wasn't just a warning to pedestrians, it was the sound of history overtaking the horse. Every cultural craze leaves behind its footprints, and the Edwardian obsession with motor cars left tyre tracks that stretched deep into the 20th century. What began as an elite indulgence, equal parts status symbol, death trap, and noisy curiosity, evolved into one of the defining forces of modern life. In the Edwardian years, cars belonged almost exclusively to dukes, duchesses, industrial magnates and royals. Within decades, they would belong to teachers, shopkeepers, and factory workers too. The Edwardians turned cars into symbols of wealth. The rest of us turned them into traffic jams. The Edwardian obsession mattered because it set the tone. Cars in those years weren't practical. They were unreliable, expensive, and often infuriating, but they were glamorous. The wealthy paraded them at races, flaunted them outside country houses, and even posed with them in portraits. By doing so, they transformed the car from a novelty into a cultural icon. This ensured that when technology improved and prices dropped, the middle classes already wanted one. The groundwork for mass adoption wasn't laid in factories, it was laid in society pages and gossip columns. Just as crucially, the Edwardian period normalised the infrastructure of motoring. Laws about licensing, speed limits, and number plates created a framework that future motorists would inherit. Motoring clubs turned cars into social institutions, campaigning for better roads and defending drivers in court. Petrol distribution may have been chaotic, but the foundations of a fueling industry were laid. By the time Henry Ford's assembly line began churning out affordable cars in America, Britain already had the cultural and legal scaffolding in place to absorb them. The Edwardians also set the stage for the aesthetic of cars, as objects of desire. Their insistence on elegance, gleaming brass fittings, polished wood interiors, luxurious upholstery, created the association between cars and status that persists to this day. Even as cars became utilitarian, the dream of owning something sleek and aspirational never went away. The Edwardians may not have invented advertising jingles, but they made sure every honk of a motor horn carried a message. I have arrived, literally and socially. On a social level, cars reshaped patterns of leisure and life. The countryside touring craze anticipated later notions of the weekend getaway. The intimate privacy of car rides foreshadowed the way automobiles would become central to romance, dating, and independence for young people. Even Edwardian mishaps, punctures, breakdowns, roadside picnics created rituals that would survive in new forms. Every family who has ever bickered over directions on a holiday drive owes something to those aristocrats stuck in hedges with their chauffeurs. The obsession also carried political consequences. Public resentment of reckless aristocratic motorists fed debates about class and privilege. Cars became symbols of inequality, shiny machines that forced everyone else into ditches. Yet this very resentment fueled the push for broader access. By the 1920s and 1930s, the dream of owning a car spread downward through the social ladder, as manufacturers produced cheaper models. What had once divided classes now became a tool to unite them in shared frustration at rising petrol prices and clogged roads. Culturally, the Edwardian car craze imprinted itself on art, literature, and collective imagination. Writers like E.M. Forster used cars as symbols of change and disruption. Playwrights mined them for comedy, cartoonists for satire. The association of cars with glamour, danger, and progress seeped so deeply into culture that later generations couldn't separate the machine from the myths. Even today, films and novels continue to treat the car as more than transport. It is freedom, status, rebellion, or romance on wheels. That imaginative leap started when Edwardian audiences first gasped at aristocrats hurtling down dusty lanes. Perhaps the greatest legacy, though, lies in the paradox of the motor car. The Edwardians adored cars precisely because they were exclusive, inconvenient, and dramatic. But by popularizing them, they guaranteed those qualities would vanish. The more ordinary cars became, the less glamorous they were. By mid-century, traffic jams and suburban commutes replaced champagne picnics and daring races. The Edwardian elite may have dreamed of speed and freedom, but what they really unleashed was congestion, insurance premiums, and the eternal misery of finding parking in central London. And yet, without their obsession, the car might never have achieved its cultural dominance. If aristocrats hadn't flaunted them as status symbols, if newspapers hadn't chronicled their scandals, if kings hadn't leaned out of them waving cigars, the car might have remained a niche invention, like the penny farthing or the dirigible. Instead, the Edwardians ensured that cars became objects of desire, and once that desire trickled down the social ladder, nothing could stop it. So the legacy of Edwardian motoring isn't just about machines, it's about culture, class, and spectacle. It's about how a noisy, unreliable contraption became the centerpiece of modern life, and it's about how progress often begins not with practicality, but with obsession. Because in the end, the Edwardians didn't just drive cars, they drove history, straight into the 20th century, horn blaring, tyres wobbling, and passengers clinging on for dear life.